It all begins in the western lands of the Mahidoro continent, where 4 years have passed since Emperor Cardion ascended the throne of the Eshrashar Empire and began systematically conquering every neighboring kingdom that dared to oppose his rule. In the midst of all this wartime chaos was a mercenary who was doing everything he could to bury his own past. His gaze carried the mysterious glint of someone who had already seen and lived through far too many intense moments on the battlefield. But the real story begins when our prota finds out he has to get married, leaving him completely shell-shocked and unable to process the situation. Faced with that sudden revelation, he questions his own father about what this means, only to be told that his bride-to-be is Baron Wibbin's daughter. His father goes on to explain that the young lady is only 16 years old, renowned for her great beauty, and that her only hobby is tending to her garden. After hearing that unbelievable news, the young man decides to open the parlor doors to face whatever destiny has in store for him. And so, at just 14 years of age, he finds himself walking toward a commitment that would completely alter the course of his life. The boy could hardly believe he had just become engaged to a noble lady he had never even laid eyes on before. He freezes completely, realizing that he is actually about to tie the knot very soon. On the day of the ceremony, dressed in a white suit, his mind remains a complete mess, utterly unable to process what is happening. He begins to wonder why on earth such a prominent noblewoman would ever agree to this marriage. He feels incredibly confused as to why an aristocrat would marry into a simple merchant family like his. But his doubts are cut short when the bride finally appears before him and greets him with utmost grace. The young man is utterly spellbound and blushes deeply upon hearing Tyria's name for the very first time. She formally introduces herself as Tyria Wibbin, walking with all the elegance of a true lady. Her golden hair reminds him of fields of wheat, while her gentle gaze and green eyes look like fresh spring sprouts. Furthermore, her fair complexion and cherry-red lips instantly catch the young man's eye. If he had to describe her in a single sentence, he would certainly say she was the most mysterious and elegant woman he had ever met. It is at that moment that the boy's father taps his shoulder, prompting Elric to finally introduce himself. Incredibly nervous, the young man bows awkwardly and says he hopes they can build a good life together from now on. Although his head is in a complete whirl, a single clear thought manages to stand out amidst all his anxiety. He realizes that, from this moment forward, he will spend the rest of his days alongside this incredible girl. Looking back, that warm feeling taking over his chest was, in fact, his very first love. He tries to hide the silly grin on his face out of pure shyness, just as they begin to exchange rings. Our prota even puts on a slightly more serious expression to hold back the immense happiness bubbling up inside him. Little did he know, he was completely oblivious to what was actually happening behind the scenes of this marriage. The boy had no idea that this forced union might be deeply hurting her feelings. Later that evening, a heavy downpour begins to fall outside the family mansion, casting a bleak mood over everything. Meanwhile, inside the bedroom, a lit candle softly illuminates the silent room. Elric anxiously fiddles with his new wedding band, still trying to process how everything happened so fast. He lets out a silly smile, thinking that such an elegant and dignified woman is now officially his wife. However, his father's words regarding the bride's true situation begin to echo in his mind once more. The smile on the young man's face slowly starts to fade as a nagging doubt begins to surface. He realizes that no matter how hard he tries to find a logical reason, this entire story simply makes no sense at all. Restless, he decides to ask the maid why a young lady of the nobility would ever agree to marry the son of mere merchants. The maid becomes visibly flustered and hesitates for a long moment before answering his question. Noticing her discomfort, the young man begs her to tell him the truth, knowing full well she is hiding something. She lets out a worried sigh and looks away, weighing whether she should truly reveal the family secret. With great reluctance, the woman finally reveals that the entire thing is nothing more than an arranged marriage born out of pure financial interest. She explains that although the bride's family was very wealthy in the past, they are now drowning in debt, and the boy's father demanded the marriage as a condition to bail them out. The deal basically consisted of paying off all the barony's debts and providing the financial backing they so desperately needed in exchange for the union. The maid adds that through this marriage, their merchant family would finally move up in the world and enter the ranks of the nobility. Connecting the dots, our prota asks in a trembling voice if this means the girl was practically sold to them. He is completely horrified and devastated as he realizes the grim reality behind his dream marriage. Feeling a massive weight on his conscience, he begins to panic, thinking about what his family has just done to the young lady's life. With that, the young man abruptly stands up and dashes out of the room, leaving the maid behind, utterly startled. The only thing on his mind was running as fast as possible to offer her an explanation. The young man rushes through the mansion corridors in a state of desperation, wanting above all else to beg for forgiveness for what was happening. He runs without stopping, tears welling up in his eyes, desperately searching for any excuse or justification to somehow comfort her. Exhausted and out of breath after running so hard, he has to brace his hand against the wall to try and catch his breath. The physical fatigue and the emotional toll of that terrible discovery nearly make him collapse right there in the hallway. He continues to pant heavily while trying to sort out his thoughts in the face of such an absurd situation, with his heart in his throat. The young man finally reaches the door of the bride's room and hesitates for a moment before grasping the doorknob. Opening it just a crack as quietly as possible, he hears a muffled sound coming from inside and decides to peek in carefully. It is at that exact moment that the boy hears heart-wrenching sobs and realizes she is crying softly in the darkness of the room. Seeing such a beautiful young lady with her face completely flushed, shedding tears of sorrow, instantly breaks his heart. She was curled up on the bed, hugging her knees in a moment of pure loneliness and despair over having been bartered away. Confronted with such a painful scene, the young man freezes completely, entirely unsure of how to react. The moment he sees her suffering up close, he makes a drastic decision and begins to take a few steps back. He swears to himself, from the bottom of his heart, that he will find a way to annul this unjust marriage as quickly as possible. A short while later, his father is sitting quietly in his study, nonchalantly signing some important family documents. The silence of the study is broken when firm, hurried footsteps begin to echo toward the door. Young Elric throws the doors wide open and shouts for his father in a highly determined and agitated manner. Without beating around the bush, the boy immediately demands that this forced marriage be called off. He throws the truth right in his father's face, questioning if the young lady only accepted the union to save her family and stating that she was practically sold. Desperate to fix things, the young man drops to his knees, begging his father to change his mind. However, the man merely speaks his son's name in an extremely cold, commanding tone. He looks down on the boy with disdain and sharply orders him to stop throwing a temper tantrum like a spoiled brat. The patriarch makes it clear that they are now part of the nobility, and that his son needs to start acting according to his new social status. The icy glare from that man shows that he doesn't possess a single shred of compassion or regret for what he did. That coldness serves as a stark reminder to the young man of the harsh reality he has always lived through. Within that house, he had always carried the painful burden of being viewed as the son responsible for his own mother's passing on the day he was born. To his father, the boy was never anything more than a mere lightning rod for resentment and a convenient stepping stone to acquire more power and wealth. Realizing he would never be able to change the mind of that greedy man, our Proda decides to turn his back and walk away. He finally accepts the bitter truth that he has always been treated as nothing more than a disposable tool. It is in this moment of rebellion that he makes the drastic decision that he needs to vanish from that house once and for all. He would do this both to set free the girl who was sold for cash and to completely derail his father's ambitious plans for his plan to work. The young man knows he will have to abandon his merchant family's surname forever. With this firm resolution set in his mind, he steps out into the middle of the storm on that dark night, carrying nothing but a backpack and a sword at his waist. The young man begins to wander aimlessly through the wheat fields beneath the pouring rain. As he walks, he cannot shake the image of his tearful bride from his head, wondering if her sadness stemmed from being bartered away or from having to leave her family behind. An even more painful doubt crosses his mind, making him question if she actually detested him. But at the end of the day, he knows that dwelling on those questions along the road wouldn't change his new reality one bit. He tries to shake off those melancholy thoughts by tossing his head, reminding himself that the decision to leave had already been made. Eventually, the young man's journey brings him to the towering walls of a massive castle under a bleak gray sky. A battle-hardened, scarred veteran guarding the area notices his approach and demands to know who goes there. Upon seeing the fierce determination in the young man's eyes, the warrior quickly deduces that he has come with the intention of becoming a mercenary. Without showing a hint of hesitation or fear before the imposing figure of the veteran, the boy answers that he has To start his new life completely from scratch and erase his past, he takes on the codename Kasha. He completely cast aside his old identity and spent the next 10 years fighting fiercely across various brutal battlefields. Wandering from war to war as a ruthless mercenary, he eventually earned the terrifying moniker of the Sword Demon, a secret that belonged only to the Elric of old. But deep down, he was just a weary man who kept wielding his greatsword in search of a peaceful place to finally rest. Clad in imposing heavy armor, his mere presence on the battlefield exuded an overwhelming, crushing pressure. His gaze was now cold and locked in, showing that the fragile boy of the past had given way to an extremely dangerous warrior. On the other side of the battlefield, the enemy troops lined up in perfect formation, fully prepared for the imminent clash. Even though he stands completely alone against an entire army, he doesn't retreat a single step and readies himself for combat. The warrior tightens his grip on the hilt of his golden sword, ready to deliver the opening blow against his opponents. With a swift, lethal movement, he charges into the enemy lines, painting the battlefield red, with his face splattered after the skirmish. He maintains the stoic expression of someone who has long grown accustomed to the violent routine of war. The scene shifts to the interior of a bustling tavern, where patrons converse in hushed tones over their drinks. The establishment's owner looks toward the entrance upon hearing the chime of the doorbell, indicating that a new customer has just arrived. With a friendly smile, the man behind the counter welcomes the visitor, who enters leaning heavily on a cane. It is Arprota himself, who now wears elegant civilian clothes but walks with a visible limp, relying on his cane for support. He walks slowly through the room under the watchful eyes of several patrons, who begin to whisper the moment they notice his presence. A few men at a nearby table look taken aback, wondering if he might be the legendary sword demon, intrigued as to why he would ever leave the battlefield. Other patrons notice his injured leg and begin to speculate whether the fearsome warrior was gravely wounded in combat. Arprota ignores the rumors and takes a seat at the bar, where he is greeted by the tavern keeper, who appears quite concerned by this obvious frailty. The young man tries to brush it off, casually commenting that it was merely a minor setback suffered during his final battle. While the owner asks if the injury is serious, the young man opens a newspaper and remarks that he will have to live with this limitation for quite some time. Suddenly, his eyes widen, and he tightly crinkles the newspaper in his grip upon spotting a completely unexpected piece of news. The tavern keeper notices his customer's abrupt reaction and calls out to him in concern, entirely unsure of what caused such sudden shock. The young man's gaze turns incredibly dark, and his eyes gleam with a reddish hue of pure indignation at what he has just read. The news featured a photograph of his own father, the man he loathed so deeply and had been trying to run from all these years. As his mind floods with bitter memories, the loud blare of a steam train whistle echoes, cutting through the calm of the late afternoon. The train barrels ahead at high speed, cutting through a mountainous landscape painted in the warm hues of the sunset. Inside one of the passenger cars, Arprota travels in silence with his cane resting beside him, staring pensively at the scenery passing by the window. He still couldn't believe that the face of the man he held so much resentment toward was printed so coldly in that corner of the newspaper. It was the obituary of his father, Hovin Portman, which meant that his primary rival in life was no longer in this world. He remembers when he ran away from home in the past, and how, deep down, he still harbored a faint hope that his father would come looking for him. At just 14 years of age, that innocent, almost childish expectation was the only thing that brought a bit of comfort to his chest. But even analyzing everything through a more mature lens nowadays, he feels that that sentiment wasn't entirely foolish back then. Despite being treated as a mere object to clear the family name, and knowing his father was to blame for the loss of his mother, the blood tie still held weight. After all, he was still that man's son, and in some hidden corner of his wounded heart, a secret wish existed. He desperately wanted his father to show at least a single drop of genuine affection for him, but he quickly dismisses that silly thought as utter nonsense. He realizes that waiting for that paternal love was always just an illusion, and now, with his father's passing, even his hatred has lost its purpose. Now, all that remained was a cowardly version of himself who would use his own father's funeral as a convenient excuse to finally return home, carrying a profound sense of emptiness and regret. The train finally begins to break as it arrives back in the homeland he abandoned 10 years ago. Upon hearing the announcement that the train has finally reached its final destination at Wibbin Station, the young man prepares to disembark. As he steps out of the station, he is instantly greeted by the breathtaking sight of golden wheat fields shimmering under the sunlight. Arprota observes the landscape with a serene, nostalgic gaze, feeling the gentle breeze brush against his face. He realizes that even though a whole decade has passed since his desperate flight, absolutely nothing has changed in this village. He walks through the quiet, peaceful streets of the town, which are completely decorated with the beautiful reddish hues of autumn leaves. The locals stroll through the area without any rush, creating a scenery that feels both incredibly familiar and completely detached from his life as a mercenary. A few children run joyfully around him playing tag, showcasing a peace that simply did not exist on the violent battlefields. He continues his way at a slow pace, hearing only the rhythmic tap of his cane striking the dirt road. A very faint, subtle smile appears on his face as he realizes he is genuinely happy to be back in this place. The wheat fields, which had always been the grand symbol of the Wibbin estate, remained immaculate, glistening under the golden light of the late afternoon. That view brings back memories of his childhood, when he used to play hide-and-seek freely with the village boys. He also fondly remembers the scoldings he would get from the maids whenever he came home with his clothes completely covered in dirt. With every new step taken on that dirt road, the memories of the past seem to gain even more strength and vivid color in his mind. The young man lets out a soft sigh, finding it curious how mere recollections could stir up so many emotions in a hardened warrior. But suddenly, his footsteps slow down until he comes to a complete halt right in the middle of the path. His expression grows quite serious as he spots something that catches his attention just ahead. He finds himself thinking about Tyria once more, wondering if the beautiful young lady he left behind was living a good life. He tries to convince himself that she must be. After all, such a lovely and gentle lady had surely found a good suitor and married by now. With that comforting thought in mind, he reaches out his hand to gently brush against the golden stalks of wheat, but his entire body freezes when a woman's voice desperately shouts Tyria's name just a short distance away. Looking back quickly, he spots a blonde girl in a straw hat carrying heavy bundles of wheat, while a maid runs over trying to help her. The staff member insists that Tyria should rest and leave that exhausting, back-breaking work to the people who are actually supposed to do it. He is left completely stunned and can barely utter Tyria's name, hardly believing that his former bride was actually standing right there in front of him. The maid tries to go after Tyria to take the wheat from her hands, but the young noblewoman keeps walking in a very firm, determined manner. Our prota watches the girl draw closer and closer, still wondering how this was even possible after being apart for so long. The two finally stand face to face in the middle of the vast golden field, bathed in the warm, reddish light of the sunset. Tyria stares at him with a deeply sorrowful and serious gaze, breaking the silence to ask him directly why he decided to come back. Feeling the heavy weight of that question, the young man stammers a bit and hesitates to find the right words to explain his return. Without leaving any room for silly excuses, she reminds him in a very clear voice that she is still, officially, his wife. Our prota lowers his head, feeling an immense wave of guilt, realizing just how incredibly foolish he had been in his past actions. He feels terrible remembering how naive he was to believe that simply vanishing into the world would be enough to annul a marriage of convenience. After all, if that union could be undone so easily, the young lady would never have been bartered away to his family in the first place. Our prota berates himself, thinking that his impulsive flight in his youth might have stripped that poor woman of every last drop of freedom she had left. Ultimately, he realizes with bitter regret just how selfish and cowardly he ended up being to the people around him. He hadn't been able to protect his own pride, let alone the woman he had agreed to share his life with. The young man feels like nothing more than a weak, selfish soul as he leans on his cane in the middle of that empty wheat field. While he was far away, covering himself in glory and blood on the battlefields while wielding his sword, Tyria was facing a quiet and incredibly difficult reality. He wonders sadly how painful and lonely it must have been for the young lady to spend all these years waiting for him completely alone in that mansion. Our prota knows full well that he needs to apologize to her immediately, but he begins to question if he even has the right to do so. He tenses up, flushing with embarrassment at the thought that she might not even want to hear his excuses or forgive his abandonment. Quite flustered and stammering heavily, he finally tries to clumsily bring up a topic just to break the ice. However, the young lady merely continues to observe him in absolute silence with her calm, expressive gaze. Without dragging out that tense moment in the field, she simply suggests politely that they head inside the mansion at once. The young lady turns around and begins walking toward the grand house, followed closely by our prota, who walks slowly, leaning on his cane. Our prota walks in silence with a deeply worried expression, feeling the tension hang heavily in the air. He bites his lip in frustration, thinking it would have been much better if she had at least yelled or shown some anger toward him. He begins to fearfully imagine that behind that calm facade, she might be harboring a dark resentment for being left behind. He questions what exactly he was expecting to find upon returning to this place after so many years of absolute silence. Suddenly, the young man is snapped out of his grim thoughts when he hears a noise and turns around. Startled, Elric's eyes widen in surprise as he spots someone very familiar rushing toward him in a hurry. While Tyria keeps walking ahead with all the calm in the world, Arproda stops completely to face the approaching person. Realizing he had fallen behind, the young lady turns around out of curiosity and softly asks if he isn't going to accompany her. Arproda is left speechless for a second, completely torn between his bride and the person who just appeared. He quickly tries to compose himself and replies that he's on his way, quickening his pace as best as he can with his limping leg. Upon arriving at the imposing gates of the Portman mansion, the young lady asks him to wait outside for a moment while she goes to call the butler. She bids him farewell politely, maintaining her usual impeccable and elegant posture, even while wearing simple farming clothes. Arproda watches in silence as the grand glass doors slide open to let his bride pass through. Left alone outside, he takes the moment to look around and take in the details of the old family estate. Arproda is struck by how everything remains exactly the same, as if time had simply frozen over the last 10 years. The beautiful water fountain in the center of the garden and the luxurious architecture of the house were exactly as they were on the day he decided to run away. He can vividly recall every single detail, from the exact number of windows down to the location of every tiny blemish on the stone walls. A nostalgic, genuine smile surfaces on the young man's face as he feels truly welcomed back by his old home. However, his peace is interrupted when a woman's voice approaches from behind, asking who that mysterious man standing there is. Arproda turns around slowly with a surprised look, instantly recognizing the owner of that familiar voice. It is Rhonda, the family's loyal maid, who is now staring at him very seriously, trying to figure out the intentions of this unknown visitor. With a massive, joyful smile on his face, the young man cannot contain himself and calls out her name in a highly cheerful manner. The woman adjusts her glasses and observes him very closely, feeling that those facial features and that tone of voice weren't entirely foreign. He lets out a light, good-natured chuckle and playfully asks if she really can't remember him. After all this time, Rhonda keeps tilting her head in deep confusion, trying to connect the features of this mature man to the boy who vanished in the past. But in the blink of an eye, the realization finally hits her, and the woman's expression transforms into utter shock as the truth sets in. With tears nearly forming in her eyes from pure emotion, she stammers, unable to believe that young Master Elric was alive and standing right there in front of her. Casting all formalities aside, the loyal maid rushes over to grasp his hands and asks emotionally if it really was her beloved, long-awaited young Master Elric who had returned. Arproda returns. The affectionate embrace warmly and softly says that it has been a long time, but he is finally back home. Rhonda sheds tears of pure joy while looking at his face, confirming that it truly is her beloved young master. She remarks emotionally that she almost didn't recognize him because he has changed quite a bit and grown so much since the last time she saw him. The young man agrees with a gentle smile, saying it's only natural she wouldn't recognize him after changing so much over the years. But in the middle of that friendly chat, a sudden thought causes his red eyes to flash with an intense, worried gleam. He remembers when Tyria firmly stated that she was still there because she was his wife, regardless of his disappearance. Being a man who spent 10 years on the battlefield surviving extreme dangers, Arproda begins to notice a massive inconsistency in this entire story. Rhonda notices his sudden silence and serious expression, asking worriedly if something is wrong. He begins to reason that he changed so much physically that even Rhonda, who raised him like a mother, couldn't recognize him at first glance. Given that, a major doubt begins to plague his mind regarding how that encounter actually played out. He tenses up completely, breaking into a cold sweat as he tries to unravel this intriguing mystery. Arproda wonders how it could possibly be that Tyria recognized him instantly, with just a single glance, when they barely even knew each other before he ran away. Meanwhile, on the upper floor of the mansion, a white curtain sways gently in the breeze coming through the grand window. Tyria gazes out pensively, staring fixedly down toward the estate's courtyard. From the heights of her bedroom, she silently watches the emotional reunion between Elric and the maid, Rhonda feeling that he was being watched. Arproda quickly turns toward the window and blushes deeply upon noticing her presence. Tyria is slightly startled to realize she's been caught spying and quickly retreats behind the curtains. With her cheeks burning with embarrassment and her breath coming in short gasps, she tries to calm herself down after that awkward catch. Our proto runs his hand over the striking scar he carries on the back of his neck, recalling his old battles. He also runs his fingers through his brown hair, thinking that these minor physical details were his only distinct traits. Ultimately, he realizes with a sigh that absolutely nothing has changed about his true essence from when he was just a boy. Later that evening, the young man decides to take a relaxing bath in a grand marble tub under the soft light of a beautiful chandelier. While resting in the warm water, displaying his battle-scarred body, the question of how Tyria recognized him so easily simply won't leave his head. He decides to step out of the tub, treading carefully on the wet floor as water drips down his legs. Our prota slips on a comfortable white bathrobe and begins to tie the sash around his waist to dry off. But as he suddenly looks forward, he lets out a gasp of absolute shock and freezes completely. To his utter astonishment, Tyria was also in the exact same room, wearing nothing but a white towel wrapped around her body. The young lady instantly turns bright red and lets out a flustered whisper upon realizing the extremely mortifying situation. Desperate to cover up, she grips the towel tightly against her chest and stammers, apologizing 1,000 times for the misunderstanding. Seeing that the young lady is on the verge of tears from pure embarrassment, our prota tries to gently reassure her so she can calm down. He approaches calmly and gestures with his hands, asking her not to shed tears over what was merely a minor bump in the road. The bride looks at him with her golden eyes wide open, surprised by the young man's sudden concern with comforting her. Suddenly, a young maid passing through the hallway with a laundry basket spots the scene through the gap in the door and lets out an ear-splitting shriek of terror. Terrified by what she has just witnessed, the staff member spins around and goes dashing down the mansion corridors at full speed. She throws open the doors to another room with all her might, shouting desperately for her mistress to know what is happening inside. What the staff member sees upon entering is the young master holding Tyria firmly in his arms to prevent her from crashing onto the floor. The two are left completely frozen and bright red with shame in front of the maid, entirely unsure of how to explain such a compromising position. Nearly crying from pure embarrassment, the young noblewoman tries to call out to the maid in a weak, flustered tone. Our prota tries to whip up a quick, clumsy excuse, saying his wife was about to slip and that he merely caught her just in time. The scene shifts abruptly to the past on the battlefield, specifically at the Chevor frontier defense line, where the soldiers of the 5th Regiment were preparing under the pouring rain. The locked-in gaze of one of the enemy combatants shows that they were fully prepared to launch a ruthless and violent assault. It was LeBron, the Vanguard Knight who led the feared elite strike team of the Imperial Army. With deafening battle cries, the troops charge across the muddy terrain with the intent of annihilating the enemy vanguard. The elite knight lets out a maniacal grin and challenges his foes, promising to slice them all in half without a shred of mercy. An absolute slaughter begins to unfold on the battlefield as violent strikes start to bring down several warriors. Utterly terrified by the knight's overwhelming power, some soldiers scream in despair upon realizing they don't stand a ghost of a chance at winning. Faced with imminent defeat, the officers order an immediate retreat of all units back behind the primary defense line. However, in the midst of all that desperate fleeing, the mercenary Kasha walks calmly in the opposite direction, carrying his greatsword over his shoulder. The enemies watch the approach of this mysterious man with disdain, questioning if he's just another low-tier mercenary hired to fight. Without giving a hoot about the outside comments, the young man slips into a combat stance with his sharp blade ready to initiate the clash. The young mercenary stares down the enemy in a firm, cold manner, showing no signs of weakness in his positioning. The elite knight charges fiercely, delivering a swift and direct strike against the young man. The loud clash of swords ringing out echoes intensely across the field as the two trade ferocious blows. With lightning-fast, precise reflexes, Kasha manages to block the impact and readies himself to launch his own counterattack. The mercenary moves in an incredibly agile manner and lands a fatal strike that sends his opponent crashing to the ground, lifeless. Right after that, the other enemy warriors begin to drop to their knees before the young man's absurd, relentless power. He doesn't hesitate and keeps delivering precise strikes, taking down every opponent who dares to cross his path. The enemy leader's helm falls into the mud of the battlefield, making the mercenaries' overwhelming victory crystal clear to the troops. The surviving soldiers watch that scene with wide eyes, completely consumed by panic and terror. Standing over the body of his defeated opponent, the young man formally introduces himself as Kasha, the mercenary warrior of Chevor. He challenges the remaining troops to come at him if they still have the guts, guaranteeing he will take down every last man who tries to fight him. But amidst the silence that settled in, our prota feels a chill and senses a mysterious, overwhelming energy heading straight for him. He reacts instantly, activating his defense and conjuring a shimmering mana shield around his own body to protect himself. However, a sudden and incredibly fast shot pierces through the barrier and strikes him dead on right at knee height. The impact forces the young man down to one knee, hand gripping the bleeding wound as he fights through the excruciating pain of that injury. Sweating bullets from the pain and deeply frustrated, he looks toward the crest of the hill to discover who fired that underhanded attack. High up on the cliffside beneath the stormy sky, two mysterious figures appear standing, observing the battlefield from afar. It was a highly unusual duo wearing gas masks, elegant top hats, and goggles, with the woman wielding a long firearm. The mercenary lets out a startled groan as he realizes the injury to his leg was caused by weaponry of highly advanced technology. The scene flashes back to the present, where the young master wakes up startled in bed, panting heavily and gripping a fruit knife tightly in his hands, with sweat dripping down his face. He realizes that awful nightmare about the battle was merely the memory of how he ended up injuring his leg. Slowly, the young man's breathing begins to calm down as the adrenaline from that bad dream fades from his body. He sits on the edge of his luxurious bed, watching the soft morning light illuminate the quiet bedroom of the Portman mansion. He looks down at the small knife in his hand and reminds himself that violent wartime routine is in the past and that he has finally returned home. Suddenly, a soft knock on the bedroom door sends our prota into a brief panic, and he quickly tucks the knife beneath the covers. Rhonda's gentle voice asks from outside if the young master is already awake to kick off the day's activities. He hesitates for a brief second before answering, still recovering from the shock of that sudden interruption. Trying to keep his voice as calm and natural as possible, he replies that he is, confirming that he's already up. With a slight smile on his face to mask his nervousness, he adds that he just woke up. Rhonda enters the room politely carrying a wooden basket and greets the young man with great warmth. As soon as the young man asks for some cold water to wash up, the maid promptly brings him a basin filled with fresh water so he can refresh himself. He puts on a clean shirt and is surprised to note how soft and comfortable the fabric is compared to the heavy, scratchy clothes he wore as a mercenary. Looking at his own reflection in the mirror, the young man feels that all this pampering and comfort were luxuries he felt he didn't deserve to receive. He tries to practice a friendly smile before his reflection, but the expression comes out looking quite awkward and forced. He realizes that smiling naturally felt like something far removed from his current reality, wondering if all those years in combat had turned his face to stone. When he steps out of the room leaning on his cane, Rhonda compliments him, saying he looks excellent in those garments, and suggests they head down for breakfast. The headmaid maintains her highly elegant and helpful posture, displaying all the affection and respect she has always held for the young man's family. During the walk down the hallway, she notices our prota's limping gait and asks what happened to him, only to hear the excuse that he merely slipped on a steep slope and hit a rock. Obviously, he could never tell the truth about how a high-tech projectile pierced his knee in combat, as he didn't want to cause unnecessary worry to anyone in his family. Rhonda lets out a light chuckle, commenting that just like in the past, he is still quite prone to minor domestic accidents, making the boy laugh sheepishly. The friendly banter between the two is cut short when the grand doors of the dining hall slide open softly before them. Upon entering the room, the young man spots Tyria from the side, sporting a calm and very serene expression. The beautiful bride turns gracefully toward our prota and asks quite politely if he managed to get a good night's rest, but the young master's mind mischievously flashes back to that embarrassing scene of the young lady wrapped in nothing but a towel in the bathroom. He turns completely red on the spot and tries to stammer out a polite reply while hearing a distant whisper calling him a creep. It was the young maid Marie, pointing an accusing finger at the boy, leaving Tyria quite flustered while Rhonda watched that confusing scene unfold. Rhonda wastes no time and delivers a corrective bop to the meddling young girl's head, sternly reprimanding her for spying on others' privacy. While Rhonda drags little Marie through the back of the hall to give her a well-deserved talking to, Tyria politely wishes that the young man has a pleasant stay in the house. Trying to clear out all that awkward, heavy mood from the room, the young man formally clears his throat. He finally flashes a friendly smile and replies that he had an excellent night's sleep, thanking them for the care and warmth on that hectic morning. When Elric asks Tyria what the name of that maid who was just here was, she answers that her name is Marie and that she was recently hired Tyria, then asks if he's worried about the fact that Marie called him a creep, making our prota jump and slam his hand on the table, completely crimson from embarrassment. He begins to gesture desperately to explain himself, saying everything is fine and that she shouldn't trouble herself over it. Right after that, the young man firmly rests his hand on the handle of his cane to try and regain his composure. Still very flushed, Elric tries to justify it by saying it was just silly curiosity since he had never seen the girl before. Tyria stares at him up close with her amber eyes and calmly asks if that was truly all it was. A somewhat awkward silence settles over the room as the two begin to eat breakfast side by side. Tyria savors the food quite peacefully and seems to be thoroughly enjoying the morning meal. Suddenly, she locks her eyes onto him to bring up an important topic that was on her mind. But Elric takes the initiative and says he needs to talk about the incident that occurred the previous day. Upon realizing he is referring to what happened in the bathhouse, Tyria turns completely red in an instant. Our prota begins to offer his sincere apologies for the occurrence, but she quickly cuts him off, saying it's perfectly fine. He still tries to press the conversation, but the young lady asks him to simply enjoy breakfast, making our prota agree sheepishly. Tyria remains seated with her face burning with embarrassment while trying to focus solely on her own food. She subtly watches him with flushed cheeks, deep in thought about what she witnessed the previous night. Meanwhile, Elric also feels self-conscious and scratches the back of his neck, entirely unsure of how to break the ice. In reality, the young bride's mind ends up drifting back to the moment she saw Elric in his bathrobe after his bath. She couldn't forget the staggering amount of scars that covered his body, wondering what kind of brutal life he must have led to survive all of that back in the present. Silence reigns at the dining table as the two continue eating without trading a single word. Elric bitterly regrets bringing up the subject and feels like this bizarre atmosphere is going to drive him crazy once and for all. To try and escape that uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible, the young man begins poking and eating the food on his plate at an extremely rapid pace. He swallows everything almost without chewing and hastily wipes his mouth with a napkin, leaving his bride quite startled by that sudden rush. With his cheeks stuffed with food, our prota flashes a thumbs up and says he's heading out, wishing her a good rest of her meal. He quickly withdraws from the hall and shuts the grand wooden doors right behind him. Tyria sits still for a moment, staring at the empty space, and merely lets out a startled sigh at that reaction. With very rosy cheeks, she softly wishes him a wonderful day. As soon as he steps out of the hall after breakfast, Elric runs into a completely bustling mansion filled with servants carrying out their daily chores. He is guided by Rhonda to speak with all the house staff, who welcome him with deep respect and open arms. One of the maids asks excitedly if it's true he tried to make a move on the mistress yesterday, while another reprimands her, saying they are already husband and wife, praising our prota as a real man. However, little Marie pops up with her arms crossed right in the middle of the hallway and calls him a creep straight to his face in front of everyone. She tells everyone to get a grip and stop sugarcoating things for the young master, leaving Elric quite flustered as he sits there on the sofa. The girl complains that he spent 10 years away, only to come back and do that to the mistress, but she is cut short by a friendly tug from another staff member. The elderly butler smiles and asks her not to be so hard on the young master, commenting that she is still far too young to understand noble marriages. He explains with a smile on his face that a noble's primary duty is to produce an heir, leaving Marie quite irritated by that meaningless justification. The man goes on to say that the young master was merely fulfilling his noble role when he walked into the bathhouse, praising his dedication even after spending 10 years away from home. While the other servants keep showering the young master with exaggerated compliments, Marie mutters that he is actually the biggest creep of them all. One of the servants asks enthusiastically if this means he has returned for good to assume his duties, and our prota merely lets out a highly awkward laugh to hide his nervousness. In reality, the young man tightens his grip on the handle of his cane, knowing full well that he still hasn't decided what he's going to do with his life from here on out. Although the injury to his knee forces him to remain there for a while, he questions himself internally how he could ever act as the true master of that mansion after being away for so many years. Elric then announces that he needs to step out briefly and that they can talk about all of this later, calming the staff's excitement. He asks the butler, Aldio, to ready the carriage for his trip, and the loyal employee promptly accepts his master's order. A short while later, the carriage begins to trundle slowly along the dirt road that cuts through the estate's immense fields of golden wheat. From afar, Tyria silently watches the vehicle's departure while walking through the plantation beneath the soft sunlight. She holds down the brim of her large straw hat as the wind blows her long blonde hair in the direction the young man is heading. The vehicle keeps distancing itself further and further from the mansion, following a path framed by the beautiful autumn scenery. The journey concludes when Elric steps down from the carriage and walks with the aid of his cane up an isolated hill, stopping right before a solitary tombstone. He observes the grave with a very serious expression and comments in a low voice that it had already been a long time since the last time he stood there. The young man stares fixedly at the tombstone of his deceased father, Hovin Portman. While the cool breeze scatters dry leaves through the air, he confesses to himself that he held deep resentment toward the man for everything that happened in his family's past. But despite all the heartache he felt in his soul, he admits he never wished for the reunion between the two to happen in such a melancholic way. Hovin Portman was the man who raised their merchant family until transforming it into the most powerful guild in the region, but his coldness also caused him to amass many enemies along the way. Elric wonders in silence if his father had ever once smiled or spoken a single kind word to him, lamenting that the man had acted like a villain up until his final day. He looks at the tombstone and thinks that if his father was going to be that strict until the bitter end, he should have at least stuck around a little longer. The wind keeps blowing the dry leaves while the young man remains standing. Facing the grave with a cocktail of emotions, he takes a deep breath and admits that he no longer holds that deep-seated grudge he used to feel for his late father. With a slightly calmer gaze, the young man decides to wrap up that moment of reflection and calls for his loyal butler, Aldio. When the man approaches, Elric asks about the cause of his father's passing and learns that he ended up passing away due to a severe heart illness. Aldio reveals that the old master hid the truth from everyone until the end, such that only he and his personal doctor knew of that ailment. The butler explains that upon realizing his days were numbered, the patriarch dedicated all his remaining strength to closing and liquidating his businesses. Elric lets out a smirk from the corner of his mouth and comments that he finds Aldio a highly curious man, asking what he saw that was so special in that cold fellow to follow him with such loyalty. With a good-natured smile on his face, the old man answers bluntly that he did it all for the money, questioning what other reason he would have to act that way. Next, the butler notices a detail and comments that the young master curiously hasn't asked a crucial question about the inheritance. Yet he refers to the fact that the entire estate and the businesses liquidated by the old master generated a colossal sum of cold, hard cash. Elric listens in silence with a highly focused expression while the butler continues his explanation regarding the destination of that fortune. Aldio finally reveals that absolutely all of this immense accumulated wealth was left as an inheritance exclusively to the young master. With the conversation wrapped up, the carriage resumes its route back home, crossing the beautiful paths lined by autumn trees. While watching the scenery pass by the vehicle's window, Elric asks if his father really didn't leave any formal written will. Aldio answers that the deceased wasn't a big fan of formalities and left only written instructions regarding the distribution, offering to show them if he is curious. The butler confesses that despite having the instructions in hand, he still can't decipher what the true intentions behind the old master's decisions were. He adds that the deceased handled that entire property distribution process in an incredibly cold and pragmatic manner. Given this, the loyal servant suggests that the young man take all the time he needs to think calmly about everything involving this inheritance. Elric locks his pensive gaze on the road ahead, digesting the new information he just received about his family's past. Suddenly, a new thought surfaces in the young master's mind regarding his bride, Tyria. He wonders for what reason she still continues living in the mansion, seeing as the marriage should have been legally annulled after he went missing for so long. Aldio reminds the young man that that commitment was, in reality, a purely political and commercial marriage arranged between the families. Elric inquires if just that commercial alliance would be justification enough for her to remain there, and the butler nods, remembering a very important detail he had forgotten to mention. The man reveals that the Portman family now holds the hereditary title of a barony, which will be automatically transferred to the young man as soon as he claims his inheritance. He also makes it clear that all that immense fortune belongs exclusively to the young master and not to the bride. Finally, the vehicle pulls up to the entrance courtyard of the Portman family's immense and luxurious mansion. While stepping down from the vehicle, Elric reflects that if her only interest were the money, she would no longer have any reason to continue there after a year since his father's passing. Our prota concludes that if she wanted to, the young bride could have taken her share of the inheritance as an attorney in fact and left a long time ago, meaning that staying there was purely her choice. Curious about the situation, Elric asks if the butler has any idea what drove the young lady to make that decision. Aldio shakes his head and answers that she has always been a very private person, admitting he never had enough rapport with her to know such confidences. He explains that the young lady possesses such a striking and distant aura of nobility that it makes any approach difficult, and that he could never force her to reveal her feelings. Elric comments that she really seems to be quite a complicated person to deal with, but the butler quickly corrects him, reminding him that she is now his lawful wife. While patting the carriage horse, the old man lets out a friendly chuckle and comments that, in truth, almost all marriages start in that exact same way. Our prota decides to drop the subject and begins to slowly climb the stone steps toward the main entrance of the house. As he approaches the entrance, he runs into Tyria standing near one of the pillars, holding a small cloth sack in her hands. She looks away shyly beneath the brim of her large straw hat, her cheeks a bit flushed upon seeing the young man nervous by his presence. The young lady begins to squeeze and fiddle with her own fingers in a very awkward manner. She takes a deep breath to regain her composure and takes a few delicate steps in his direction. Elric is surprised by her presence out there and calmly asks if she has just returned from her stroll. A bit bashful, the young lady asks at what moment the young man managed to arrive from his trip. She explains that she just arrived and was returning from a walk through the estate's extensive wheat fields. Upon hearing her soft answer, the young master feels his face heat up slightly and tries to mask his own shyness. He then suggests that the two head inside the mansion together, and the young lady promptly accepts the invitation with a nod of her head. The sound of their footsteps echoes through the grand and luxurious entrance hall as they walk side by side. Elric tries to think of a topic to break the ice and blames himself internally for being so clumsy at starting a normal conversation. Glancing sideways at the girl, he notices that even while wearing such simple country clothes, she still carries a very impressive, natural aura of nobility. The young man tries to jog his memory and begins to wonder if she already possessed that same striking presence 10 years ago when they first met. He remembers the day of their wedding, when she wore a bridal veil and looked incredibly beautiful and timid. Suddenly, Elric's foot slips slightly on the smooth floor, startling the young man instantly. He loses his balance for a second and nearly falls, leaving Tyria quite worried as she asks if he is all right. Fortunately, our prota manages to steady his cane on the floor very quickly and avoids the fall. He tries to hide his embarrassment by flashing a sheepish smile and saying he's great, but wonders how long she had been watching him limp like that. While they keep climbing the staircase, the young man apologizes for not being able to carry the sack of wheat for her due to his leg trouble. The young lady calmly answers that it's fine and that she's already gotten used to it, making our prota feel guilty for leaving her alone for so long and now showing up offering overdue apologies. Tyria focuses her gaze from the side and seems to be lost in her own memories of that lonely time. She explains that she got used to the heavy labor because she learned everything directly from his late father. Elric is quite surprised to hear this and comments that that was definitely just like his rigorous father. He remembers how his father was an obstinate man who needed to check every detail of the businesses personally, including the wheat fields. Our prota reflects that out of all the businesses his father closed before passing away, the wheat farm was the only one left, and that the man certainly placed the management of it into Tyria's hands. At that moment, the two suddenly stop walking right in the middle of the mansion's grand hallway. Elric decides to break the silence and begins to ask a new question, catching his bride's attention. Staring fixedly at the grand portrait of his father on the wall, he asks what the old patriarch's days were like before he passed away. The young lady answers with sincerity that she only learned the farm work from him and doesn't remember much past that. Our prota tightly grips the metal handle of his cane while trying to digest those few words of hers. He gathers his courage and asks if by any chance his late father ever brought up his name. Tyria answers bluntly that he never spoke of him, causing the young man to continue walking while trying not to show his disappointment. Elric thinks to himself that the union between a cold father and a woman of few words could only result in strictly professional dialogues. He merely nods in a low voice, accepting the answer while passing by the imposing portrait on the wall. The young lady excuses herself, saying she needs to get back to her daily chores, leaving our prota confused because he thought she had already finished everything for today. She explains that she still needs to review all the administrative paperwork, which leaves the young master quite surprised by such sheer dedication. Elric asks if she really tends to the wheat field during the day and spends her nights reviewing reports, and the young lady confirms she does. She bids him farewell, saying the two will see each other again at dinner time, and our prota merely nods in a pensive manner. He watches her walk away down the hallway, feeling that there is something highly intriguing about his bride's behavior. At that moment, a sharp wave of guilt hits our prota, who realizes that all that heavy responsibility should have been his if he hadn't run away from home years ago. He thinks he would feel less guilty if she displayed some resentment, but realizes she has never let out a single complaint about the situation. Feeling the weight of that revelation, the young man keeps walking slowly with the aid of his cane through the silent corridors. Suddenly, a loud noise of something dropping startles our prota and makes him turn around quickly to see what happened. It was Marie, who had tripped and dropped a wooden box full of letters that were now scattered all over the floor. The little girl panics, unsure of what to do with that mess, while Elric observes her in a quite curious manner. He kneels down to help gather the scattered paperwork, and when the maid worries about his leg, our Prota replies that it's no trouble at all and asks what all those letters are. Marie explains that all of them are correspondences sent directly to her mistress, leaving our Prota intrigued while holding one of the envelopes. He comments with a slight smile that the amount of correspondence there is truly impressive, but his smile instantly vanishes, and his eyes widen upon noticing the red wax seal stamped on the paper. He realizes that all those letters were sent by the Wibbin family and carried messages addressed to their daughter. Moved by curiosity, the young master decides to open one of the papers to find out what was written there. In the letter, Tyria's father begged his daughter to stop waiting for a man who would never come back, suggesting she grab what she could from the fortune and return home to find a new husband. Elric realizes that his father left the entire fortune in his name, leaving absolutely nothing to Tyria, despite her having worked tirelessly for the estate for 10 years. He thinks it would have been perfectly fair and acceptable if she had simply taken a portion of the assets and left just as her family, suggested alone in his study. The young man rests his head in his hands, trying to understand if the reason she stays there is merely to protect his father's legacy. But he soon realizes that this answer still doesn't perfectly explain the entire situation and wonders what truly motivated her. He remains seated at his desk, pensive and plunged into deep reflection regarding his bride's actions. His reddish eyes gleam in the dim light while he tries to connect all the clues he has uncovered so far. If her goal were just to keep the money, she could have simply taken her share right after the old patriarch's passing a year ago, without needing to wear herself down so much. Determined to find concrete answers, our Prota begins to rifle through the drawers and the papers scattered across the desk. He opens a deep drawer and finds exactly what he suspected, a massive stack of identical letters stored inside. Elric analyzes the envelopes and finds that all the letters in that drawer began arriving right after his father's passing. He discovers that the gist of all the messages was exactly the same, and that the bride likely never replied to a single one of them, since the latest letters practically begged for any sign of life. Faced with all those revelations, Elric merely lets out a long sigh and tries to process the situation. He realizes she was protecting tooth and nail an estate that belonged to a nobleman whose return was never guaranteed. Our Prota notes that the young lady hid everything in such an impeccable manner that not even the clever butler Aldio suspected the existence of those letters. This meant that during this entire past year, she had been facing that difficult battle completely alone and without anyone's support. She bore the full weight of managing the lands and dealing with the pressure from her own family to abandon everything. Elric reflects that he would never have the right to blame her if she had taken the money and left, questioning why she chose to lead such a painful and complicated life. Later that evening, in her quarters, Tyria sits in front of her luxurious vanity to get ready with utmost care for the night. She delicately ties a beautiful white bow into her long golden hair while looking at herself in the mirror. Clad in a beautiful and elegant blue gown, she displays a posture of extreme nobility and grace. At that moment, little Marie watches her mistress with eyes glittering with excitement and celebrates that the moment has finally arrived. The maid gets super hyped up as she shares that the young master specifically asked to meet with his wife before anything else. Marie grumbles, remembering that his behavior in the bathroom was a total embarrassment, but notes that the butler Aldio gave her a major piece of advice. The little girl comments in a sly manner that producing an heir would also be something excellent for her mistress's future, leaving Tyria quite confused and bashful at the remark without wasting any time. The small maid begins skipping with joy while pacing around the room. She firmly grips the fabric of her lady's blue gown to grab her attention. Marie drops to her knees before her and begs with a dramatic gaze for her mistress to listen closely to her advice. Whining in an exaggerated manner, the servant insists that our Prota is a creep who might run away at any moment and that she needs to find a way to lock him down at the mansion. With a hilarious and desperate expression, the little girl screams that the two need to hit the sheets as soon as possible to have a baby. Tyria merely lets out a highly awkward laugh while the maid keeps rattling on excitedly about having several kids who look like her mistress to prevent them from turning out like a creep like their father. Suddenly, two soft knocks on the grand wooden door interrupt the lively chatter and leave the two in silence. From outside, the respectful voice of the butler Aldio warns that it is time for the meeting, and Tyria promptly replies that she is on her way out. The two begin walking side by side down the carpeted corridors of the Portman mansion. The young lady follows the butler with her heart racing, wondering what the important matter could be, since that was the first time our Prota had requested a private meeting with her. The old man grasps the golden doorknob and slowly slides open the imposing doors of the parlor. He announces the arrival of the young mistress in a highly formal manner and makes way for her to enter the room. Seated elegantly beside a tea table set for two, Elric receives her with a warm greeting of welcome. A bit timid, Tyria offers a slight curtsy and walks gracefully toward the table. The metallic click of her shoes echoes through the luxurious room as she approaches the young man. Elric takes a calm sip from his teacup to mask his nervousness and prepare for the conversation that was to come. The two newlyweds sit face to face, surrounded by the solemn silence of the grand and luxurious sitting room. Our prota takes the initiative and offers a sincere apology for opening the letters without permission, explaining that he stumbled upon them by chance after the maid's minor accident. He delicately points to the envelope on the table and asks if he could question her openly regarding the contents of those messages from her family. Tyria's eyes widen, and she lets out a startled gasp upon realizing the secret she guarded with such zeal had been uncovered. She immediately lowers her head, letting her golden hair drape over her expression of extreme worry. The young lady panics internally, fearing that he might misunderstand her intentions and view her as some opportunistic gold digger. After the inheritance, Elric continues the dialogue, commenting in a mild manner that he found out she spent this entire past year ignoring all those messages from her parents. With his gaze fixed on her, Dawn, he reveals that the only reason he called her there was to understand why she protected his inheritance, even without any guarantee that he would return alive. He points out frankly that she could have very well taken all that fortune for herself and left without giving explanations to anyone he knows full well that, for all intents and purposes, she was practically a complete stranger to him. It was an inexplicable mystery why someone so distant would go to the trouble of sacrificing so much to protect a stranger's wealth. He looks down at her hands clenched tightly in her lap and asks in a calm manner why she chose not to return to the safety of her old family. Tyria takes a deep breath, raises her gaze with absolute firmness, and utters only her married surname. With an impressive determination gleaming in her green eyes, she states out loud that her lawful name is now Tyria Portman. She adds that she is no longer a young girl belonging to the Wibben family, but rather the true mistress and caretaker of the House of Portman. Next, the young lady politely stands up and asks to be excused to withdraw, claiming she still has many pending tasks to sort out tonight. She turns around and begins walking toward the exit, maintaining her elegant and impeccable posture as she leaves the parlor. Elric remains still, watching her departure with a surprised expression and completely unsure of what to say in the face of such firmness. While his bride's silhouette vanishes through the door, the young man remains seated, pensive, reflecting on the impactful words he just heard. But his mind still echoes that very same question of his regarding her reasons for sacrificing so much to guard the inheritance of a man she didn't even know would return. He remembers when she softly parted her lips to begin offering her true answer to that doubt of his. With very rosy cheeks, Tyria hesitates for a split second before finally starting to speak what she truly felt. She looks into his eyes with great determination and says bluntly that she acted that way simply because she is his wife. Back in the present, Elric firmly grips a small letter opener while recalling that striking conversation. He remains seated in the imposing chair of his late father, completely deep in thought before this entire situation. He cannot shake her phrase from his head about being the mistress of the Portman house and no longer belonging to her old family. In a swift, firm motion, the young man plunges the small knife directly into the wood of the desk. He wonders if all that effort and dedication of hers were motivated solely by a sense of responsibility and duty as a noblewoman. Our prota realizes she protected every piece of the estate not out of greed, but to fulfill her duty, which ended up reminding him of an old acquaintance from his past. It was Knight Elvis Graham, a highly honorable man our prota met on the battlefields. Elric recalls when he met Elvis in the war, where they acted basically as master and servant in a clash that ended up turning victorious for them. However, that wasn't a complete victory, because Elvis ended up suffering severe injuries that left him paralyzed, preventing him from ever fighting again. Even bound to a wheelchair, that man kept insisting that he needed to do everything he could to fulfill his duty. He argued that nobles carried a massive weight of responsibility and should always serve as an example for society. At the time, Elric actually questioned him if he wasn't just the son of a concubine, being in reality half commoner. Elvis merely smiled and answered that he preferred to view himself as half noble, joking that because he only fulfilled half his duties, he ended up losing half his body. True to his words, the knight did indeed retire from combat and began living a peaceful life, coming to marry a few years later. Back in the present, Elric removes the knife plunged into the wood with a firm yank. He murmurs to himself about the weight of the words responsibility and duty, noticing how people cling to these concepts. Although he knows he can never repay Tyria for 10 years of sacrifice, our Prota decides he won't sit idly by without doing anything to help her. He deduces that her family will keep sending persistent letters to grab the inheritance and realizes they are likely unable to come personally to the mansion. The young master recognizes she will never reveal her true feelings due to being far too private, even if he insists on asking. Fortunately, our Prota cooks up a simple plan and decides that the best way to uncover the truth is by going straight to the source of it all. He resolves to pay a surprise visit to the imposing estate of the Weben family. Standing before the immense iron gates, Elric observes the opposing mansion with close attention and decides on a direct approach. The young nobleman, dressed in an elegant and tailored suit, recognizes that their residence is indeed quite grand and luxurious. Meanwhile, the news of the young man's sudden arrival begins to spread rapidly inside that massive mansion. Tyria's parents pace irritably through the entrance hall, complaining about the young man's audacity to show up right now after so many years of disappearance. The mother grumbles while waving her fan, saying he should have vanished for good, and accusing the boy of returning solely out of pure greed for the inheritance. Tyria's father displays a grim expression, worried about the possibility of his son-in-law trying to legally claim rights over the Portman family fortune. The two keep walking with firm steps, determined not to make things easy for the newcomer. The noble couple advances with an arrogant and cold posture toward the parlor where the young man awaits them. The man curses in a low voice, calling Elric commoner trash and accusing him of caring only about material goods. The woman spews all her venom, commenting on the 10 years their daughter wasted waiting for him and the high cost they incurred to raise her. The patriarch focuses his thoughts entirely on the immense fortune that Hovan Portman left behind. The wife fully agrees and states with conviction that they need to use that outside wealth to make up for the alleged losses they suffered. The nobleman grips the golden doorknob firmly to finally enter the meeting room. The grand doors open with a creak and reveal the young master, elegantly dressed and waiting for them. Our Prota offers a polite bow of his head, introducing himself formally and apologizing for the delay in visiting them. Tyria's father ironizes, saying it really was very difficult to get a glimpse of his son-in-law's face after 10 years, while the mother flashes a fake smile from behind her fan. Seated at the massive banquet table, Elric goes straight to the point and reveals that he read the correspondence sent to the Portman mansion by them. The father-in-law finds it ridiculous that he only read the message now, but tries to justify sending it by saying he acted merely as a father worried about his daughter's abandonment for a decade. He throws it in his son-in-law's face that he turned the Portman family into nobility and accuses him of being shameless for vanishing. Quickly touching upon the subject of the valuable inheritance left by old Hovan, the nobleman lets out a sarcastic laugh, disdaining Elric's origin and his current physical disability, stating he highly doubts his capacity to manage that fortune. He continues his verbal assault, reminding him that it was his daughter who took care of everything during that period, and says he will speak very clearly for the young man to understand. The man announces without any shame that they intend to confiscate the entire inheritance as fair payment for the abandonment suffered by Tyria. He says it would be a total nerve of Elric to try and claim the assets now, and questions if the young man would even know how to put that fortune to any useful use. The mother-in-law agrees with her husband from behind her fan, pointing out that her son-in-law seems incapable of managing the lands and feigning pity for the emotional suffering her daughter went through alone. With greedy smiles, the two suggest that the best for everyone would be for them to assume total control of the money. Elric merely tilts his head slightly and lets out a calm sigh in the face of that couple's hypocrisy. He feels a deep disgust upon realizing that behind all that smooth talk of family duty, their sole and true goal was to steal every last cent of his inheritance. Elric realizes they don't give a hoot about their own daughter and are just focused on usurping the money and the farmlands to line their own pockets. That petty attitude is so repulsive that the young man feels he can't stand spending another second listening to that couple's nonsense. Maintaining his external calm, he takes a deep breath, raises his head with a smirk, and begins to speak. Our Prota apologizes for not bringing his wife along with him, justifying that she was extremely busy with the farm duties. The father-in-law snaps immediately, slamming the table and yelling for him to stop changing the subject, since they were in the middle of discussing the inheritance rights. He furiously orders his son-in-law to cast aside his greed and hand over the fortune to them, throwing in his face once more the fact that he vanished for 10 years. The woman also joins her husband, accusing her son-in-law of being incredibly greedy, causing the young man to place his hand over his face and let out an ironic laugh upon hearing that. With a cold, piercing gaze, Elric stares down the man and asks what exactly he plans to do if he decides to act with the very greed they are commenting on. The nobleman gulps down hard, startled by that sudden change of tone, while the son-in-law repeats the question in an intimidating manner about what they would do if he actually resolved to keep everything. Elric presses them to say something, questioning why they went completely silent after speaking in such an arrogant and imposing manner seconds ago. He asks if their arrogant mouths have already dried up, while the father-in-law's hand begins to tremble with pure rage and helplessness on the table. Completely derailed and out of arguments, the man merely yells furiously, calling his son-in-law an insolent wretch. But Elric merely stares at him with his cold, red eyes, saying in a dark tone that the man has finally begun to understand who he was dealing with. The young man remembers that he spent 10 years surviving on the most cruel battlefields of the continent and learned that he doesn't need outbursts or useless rage to subjugate an opponent. He knows full well that his cold and calculated actions in combat always brought the results he desired in an inevitable manner. Back at the table, our Prota coldly advises his father-in-law to keep his mouth shut if he wants to continue receiving any kind of financial aid from that farm. He lets out a light chuckle and comments on how ridiculous that scene is, since the only person with a real right over the assets was their own daughter, and not the couple sitting there making fools of themselves. While the tense silence settles in, the image of Tyria flashes once more through the young master's mind. Elric stands up and begins walking toward the exit, completely ignoring the hysterical threats of his father-in-law, who yells that he will come to the Portman mansion to finish him off. Without stopping his stride, the young man merely replies coldly that he will be waiting for them if they have the guts. Shortly after, the young master's carriage distances itself rapidly from that estate. Following the path framed by beautiful green trees alone inside the vehicle, the young man places his hand over his face and lets out a long sigh of fatigue and frustration. He feels deeply ashamed of his own actions, questioning if at the end of the day he is truly any different from those greedy nobles, since to Tyria he is still a sinner who abandoned her. He wonders if he truly confronted her parents to defend her from all that exploitation, or if he merely spoke all those harsh words driven by a selfish and twisted sense of superiority over his adversaries. The young man admits to himself that what he felt wasn't compassion for his wife, but rather a dark sense of pleasure at crushing and humiliating that petty couple. He recalls how his late father used to act in that exact same cold and merciless way to impose his will over other people. Elric gulps hard upon realizing that perhaps he isn't different in the slightest from his late father, acting as just another selfish and calculating fellow. Suddenly, the coachman slams on the carriage brakes in an abrupt manner, startling the passengers with the vehicle's sudden halt. Feeling a strong wave of nausea and sickness from his own thoughts, Elric shoves open the vehicle door in a rush. He steps down from the vehicle, stumbling, and leans against one of the wheels to heave, completely suffocated by the anguish he felt in his chest. Panting and with sweat dripping down his face, the young man stares at the ground while trying to regain his strength and breath. He murmurs with extreme bitterness that he views himself as a truly miserable and unsalvageable human being for being so similar to the people he despised most. But the young man's moment of self-deprecation is interrupted by a soft rustle of leaves moving very close by. He turns his face to the side, slightly startled, trying to identify the source of that sound in the middle of the greenery. His eyes widen in surprise as he focuses his vision on a familiar figure who was walking through the wheat fields. It was Tyria, who was walking peacefully under the soft light of the late afternoon right in the middle of the farm's golden plantation. She wore a white kerchief on her head and looked incredibly serene while the breeze scattered leaves and the aroma of wheat through the air. The young master utters his bride's name in an almost inaudible whisper, hypnotized by that calm sight. Without thinking twice, he begins running in her direction in a desperate manner through the bushes. While running clumsily because of his injured leg, he thinks about how much she must have suffered silently at the hands of her own greedy parents during all those years. He remembers the suffering she also went through dealing with his late father and with the absence of her own groom who had departed for the war. Marie and Aldio observe the scene from a distance, completely confused by that sudden dash of the young master through the brush. Tyria hears the hurried footsteps and turns around gracefully beneath the golden light of the sunset. Elric finally reaches her and grips her arm in a highly firm and desperate manner. He enfolds her hands and lowers his head in a weary manner, leaving the young bride extremely surprised by that unexpected reaction. The young man rests his forehead in a trembling manner against her shoulder and begins to stammer out his words of outpouring. Tyria listens to him with a watchful gaze while the young master begs for forgiveness in tears for abandoning her for 10 long years and for trying to justify his own selfishness. Completely broken emotionally, he bows before her and admits that all the pain and trials she had to endure alone were his fault. The beautiful bride observes him with an expression of immense surprise upon hearing that so sincere and painful confession from the young man on his knees before her. She then remembers years ago when a young Elric tried to scare off some wild hounds with a stick to protect little Tyria. After chasing the beasts away, he turns to the girl and asks with worry if she is all right and if she didn't end up bitten by any of them. The young girl says she is fine, but right after looks startled at Elric's leg, which is bleeding quite a bit. Elric is startled to see the wound and complains irritably that those lousy beasts managed to hurt his leg for real. Tyria gets a bit shy and asks in a very gentle way for him to come closer to her for a moment, while she bandages his injury with great care. The boy says his name is Elric Portman, and warns that he only did that because the attack happened on his family's lands, so she doesn't need to thank him. Noticing her silence, Elric asks if she is always this quiet and brags, saying it would be good for her to be nice to him since in the future, he's going to become a royal knight. The girl remains without saying a single word, merely turning even redder and more embarrassed by the boy's comment. Tyria finally finishes the bandage and steps back, causing the young man to thank her half sheepishly upon seeing the good job she did. Elric finds that curious and comments that she looks like a noble lady, asking where she learned to treat wounds so well like that. Tyria whispers softly that her nanny always took care of her, but Elric can't hear a thing and demands irritably for her to speak louder. Ashamed of being called out like that, the little girl merely looks away even more bashful. Losing patience, Elric says she will never get anywhere in life being so timid, and warns that if she keeps acting this way, she won't even be able to get married. But right after, he turns entirely red and mutters that if he really becomes a royal knight, he might even agree to marry her. Hearing that makes little Tyria's heart race with emotion as she stares at the boy with wide open eyes. Feeling embarrassed by her silence, Elric begins to bellow, telling her not to get ahead of herself just because she's pretty, claiming he only suggested that because she is good at healing wounds, Tyria simply turns her back and begins to leave in silence, leaving Elric furious, yelling that she will still beg to marry him when he is an elite knight. Far from his eyes, however, the little girl flashes a very subtle and enamored smile while walking back home. Back in the present, the memory of that proud young man named Elric Portman resonates in the mind of the one observing the past. Tyria holds with much affection a small picture frame with the photo of her husband when he was still just a cheeky little boy. She remembers fondly that he ended up not turning into a royal knight, but wonders if their reunion after so much time can be called destiny. As the sun sets, coloring the sky above the mansion, the headmaid Rhonda orders Marie to prepare the tea set for the couple. Shortly after, Tyria walks calmly through the mansion's grand hallway. Being guided by the headmaid, Rhonda comments subtly that the young master's expression seemed quite worried and tense on that day. This causes Tyria to feel butterflies in her stomach, wondering anxiously what the real reason her husband asked to talk to her was. Upon arriving before the study, the headmaid knocks on the door and announces that the mistress of the house has just arrived. The two settle into the armchairs of the luxurious room, maintaining a quite heavy and awkward silence between them. Tyria tries to break the ice and says nervously that she has something she would very much like to share with him. But Elric interrupts her gently, explaining that in reality, he called her there precisely because he badly needed to say something very serious to her. Looking directly into his wife's eyes, he takes a deep breath and offers a sincere apology. Tyria is left completely shocked and out of reaction at that so sudden apology coming from him. Elric explains that he wants to apologize for everything that happened 10 years ago, mainly for leaving and abandoning her alone right on their wedding day. He admits that back then he was just a foolish and impulsive young man who couldn't see the disastrous consequences of his own rebellious actions. The young man goes on to say that he knows how much she must have suffered silently and all the difficulties she faced alone because of his departure, reinforcing how much he regrets it, with his heart in his hand. He finally asks if she would be able to accept his apologies for all this time of absence. Tyria observes him with sweetness and calmly answers that he has no reason at all to apologize to her. She explains with serenity that she never held a grudge against anyone and that remaining in that mansion was entirely her choice, so there is no guilt at all for him to carry. She goes on to say that if they don't resolve this once and for all, Elric's heart will never find true peace. Precisely because of that, with an extremely warm smile on her face, she says she formally accepts his apologies. Hearing those words brings a gigantic relief to Elric's chest, who cannot contain a sincere smile of happiness. He thanks her from the bottom of his heart for accepting his forgiveness, affectionately calling her my lady. Shortly after, the two begin walking side by side through the room. While the young master advances limping slightly with the aid of his cane, Tyria asks worriedly if his leg is feeling a bit better, and he replies that he's fine, trying to change the subject right after he apologizes for taking up her time, knowing how busy she must be with the house chores, but she asks him not to talk nonsense. Tyria hesitates for a split second and says she would like to ask a special favor of her husband, receiving his permission to speak freely. Quite embarrassed and with a flushed face, the young lady asks if from now on he could stop calling her my lady. She stammers and tries to complete the sentence in an extremely cute and bashful way. Elric gets quite confused by that reaction and apologizes for not hearing right what she wanted to say. But before she can finish, the door suddenly flies open with young Marie entering all excited to serve afternoon tea. The sudden scare causes Elric to lose his balance and his cane slips, causing him to start falling backward in a totally clumsy manner. In the middle of the confusion, Elric ends up crashing directly on top of Tyria, falling into an extremely embarrassing position on the floor. While Marie stands frozen in shock at the scene, the butler Aldio takes the chance to joke about the situation and asks if they were already making plans to have an heir. Completely red with shame, the young master scrambles up and yells desperately that things are nothing like what the butler is thinking. Marie begins to apologize in a panic, but Aldio covers the girl's eyes and says the two should pretend they didn't see that grown-up matter. To make matters worse, the butler flashes a thumbs up and warns that he will alert all the servants to never again interrupt the couple's intimacy, totally ignoring Elric's shouts of protest. Alone again with his wife, the young man tries to catch his breath and contain his mortification to apologize for the occurrence, but upon seeing Tyria still down on the floor, completely red and flustered, he backs away rapidly, begging for forgiveness. Before closing the door for good, the meddling Aldio takes one last peek and tells them to enjoy their time alone, leaving the master even more furious. The door finally closes with a soft click, leaving behind a silence loaded with shyness in the study. In the middle of the quiet night that wraps around the mansion, Elric's desperate shout still echoes from afar, trying to explain the misunderstanding the following morning. The first rays of sun stream through the mansion's grand windows, while the birds chirp outside. The headmaid Rhonda enters the young master's room and asks with all her usual elegance if he had coughed. Elric greets her with a much lighter and more joyful smile than usual, seeming to have had an excellent night's sleep. Rhonda immediately notices the young man's good mood and comments that he seems much more energetic, asking if something good happened the previous night. With a sly smirk, the headmaid comes closer and whispers if they would already have news regarding a little heir on the way. Elric turns red on the spot and yells that no matter what that old creep Aldio went around spreading, things are not like that, causing Rhonda to laugh, finding it a pity. But next, the headmaid adopts a more serious tone and warns that what happened the previous night shouldn't be treated merely as a simple incident of no importance. Seeing the young man's cluelessness, she turns around in a dramatic way and asks if he is truly questioning that out of pure ignorance. She steps closer, commanding respect, and reminds him that he abandoned his wife for 10 long years, explaining that this time weighs in a much more painful way for a woman, imploring him to never leave her lonely ever again. Meanwhile, in another room of the mansion, Tyria still rests peacefully in her massive bed beneath the soft morning light. Upon opening her eyes, she flashes a radiant smile and thinks that that morning feels much fresher and more invigorating than all the others. She stares at the photo of young Elric in the picture frame and asks softly if her beloved master managed to sleep well. With her heart full of joy, she places the object on the nightstand, feeling that the distance between the two has finally shrunk a bit after yesterday's sincere talk. She stretches all happy and begins to weigh the idea of going personally to wish him a good morning every day from now on. The day advances, and the golden sunlight illuminates the vast cultivation fields that surround the family's immense estate. In the dining hall, the young couple gathers to savor a hearty breakfast, but the gigantic table ends up leaving the two a bit far apart. While the delicious food is served, silence reigns in the room, which is decorated with extreme good taste. Tyria takes a light forkful of her meal and chews in an extremely delicate and silent manner. Elric, on the other hand, sits completely tense and sweating cold from nerves, finding that atmosphere incredibly awkward after everything that happened the day before. His mind insists on reliving the scene where he fell on top of her, causing the young man to nearly choke from embarrassment in the middle of breakfast. Suddenly, Tyria calls him calmly, causing the young man to jump in his chair and answer in a stuttering, startled way. With slightly flushed cheeks, the young lady asks with all the grace in the world if he would have some free time to accompany her on a stroll that day. The sudden invitation leaves Elric quite surprised and blinking his eyes without fully understanding. Fearing he might get the wrong idea, Tyria begins gesturing nervously and hastily explains that it's just a routine inspection of the lands on account of the harvest festival that is coming up. Comprehending the situation, the young man relaxes instantly and cracks a friendly smile as he remembers the traditional event. Without hesitating, he answers in a very gentle way that he will have the greatest pleasure in accompanying her on this inspection of the lands. Hearing her husband's confirmation brings a massive relief to Tyria, who flashes an extremely sweet and grateful smile. A while later, behind the closed doors of the dressing room, the maids help the noble mistress adjust the details of her garments. For the stroll, Marie drops to her knees to fix the hem of Tyria's beautiful dark blue dress, while the other staff members praise how stunning the mistress looks. Satisfied with the result, Rhonda guides Marie to keep helping the mistress, while she herself goes to the young master's quarters to check his clothes. Upon entering the room, she cracks a smile upon noticing that he has already finished getting dressed by himself, but her expression changes rapidly upon focusing on the chosen outfit. The headmaid's smile instantly vanishes, replaced by a squinted gaze of pure disbelief and disapproval. That is because Elric resolved to wear a full adventurer outfit, complete with a gigantic hat, asking with the straightest face if there exists any clothes more practical for walking through the brush. Outraged, Rhonda grabs him by the arm and begins dragging him back, complaining that he is going to do a peaceful inspection and not march into a war dressed like an outlaw. The door slams shut with a bang while the headmaid prepares to solve that style catastrophe by force. Even while being dragged like a stubborn child, Elric insists on saying that he is already quite grown up and knows perfectly well how to dress himself, but Rhonda doesn't want to hear excuses, shoving the young man back onto the sofa without the slightest ceremony and telling him to sit tight right there. With an intimidatingly focused gaze, she warns that a true nobleman needs to dress with dignity and that she is going to remake his entire look from scratch right then and there. Ignoring the young man's protests, she begins ripping off that drab jacket and the loud hat with impressive agility. Surrendering to the headmaid's relentless treatment, Elric merely bursts out laughing and begs for her to at least let him put on the new clothes by himself. Once chosen, Rhonda jokes, asking if the young master is shy around her now, reminding him that when he was little, he used to strip off his clothes and run from one side to the other. Elric tries to cut the small talk and asks for her to stop with the teasing and just hurry up with that at once. But without losing time, Rhonda advances determinedly to take his shirt off, catching the young man totally by surprise with her enthusiasm. However, as soon as his shirt is opened, the headmaid covers her mouth in complete shock upon seeing what was hidden there. The young man's chest and abdomen are riddled with deep and terrifying scars from past battles, revealing the harsh reality he passed through in the war. Trembling a bit with emotion, the woman asks with eyes full of tears, what all those marks on his body mean. Elric tries to ease the mood with a sheepish smile, commenting that it was exactly for this reason that he wanted to dress himself. Desolate, Rhonda holds back her crying and asks what truly happened to him during all those years he was away from home. He holds his loyal headmaid's hand with affection and apologizes, promising that he will tell her everything with details when the right moment arrives. The young man then begs for her to keep this an absolute secret from Tyria, as he doesn't want to worry his wife with his wounds of the past. Quite emotional, Rhonda clenches her fists and cries in silence upon realizing how much her young master has grown and become protective. She agrees to the request and warns that, from now on, she will be the only person authorized to help him get dressed to prevent other people from seeing the marks, receiving a sincere thank you from him. Sometime later, Elric goes down to the entrance and asks Aldio if the carriage for the stroll is already totally ready, now dressed like a true and elegant young master. The young man boasts an impeccable look that commands a lot of respect. The butler admits with good humor that he was afraid the master would show up dressed like an outlaw and make the mistress faint from shame, but sees that his worry was in vain. Elric laughs and jokes, saying that nearly happened for real, but by luck the headmaid Rhonda intervened in time to save him from disaster. At that moment, a soft voice surfaces, asking for forgiveness for the delay. Catching everyone's attention at the mansion's entrance, Tyria approaches, wearing a stunning and elegant dark blue outfit, explaining all flustered that she put a lot of effort into the styling, since it was their first official stroll together. Upon seeing her looking so wonderful, Elric stands completely frozen and with his cheeks red from embarrassment, managing only to stammer that she looks absolutely lovely. The young lady thanks him shyly with a beautiful smile, while Rhonda watches from afar and decides to keep the master's previous choice of clothes a secret, just so it won't ruin her happiness. Arm in arm, and with a much lighter mood between the two, the couple finally boards the luxurious carriage to kick off the stroll. Upon arriving at the bustling market of the Portman estate, the local residents begin to notice the presence of illustrious visitors. People begin whispering in surprise, rapidly spreading the news that the young man who had departed years ago has finally returned to his lands. But instead of criticism, the majority of the residents receive him with immense affection and open smiles, causing the young master to return the friendliness in the supplies district. An elderly lady named Michelle runs enthusiastically to hug him, shocked to see how that mischievous little boy turned into such a handsome man. Further ahead, in the area of the inns and general stores, other childhood acquaintances shout excitedly upon realizing that he truly is back in town. They quickly notice the cane and ask worriedly what happened to his leg, causing Elric to explain in a casual way that it was just a minor accident. Suddenly, a loud and familiar voice echoes through the street, calling the young man "boss," causing him to turn around curious to see who it is. To his surprise, it is Bart, his great childhood friend, who runs in his direction with a grin from ear to ear. The two old friends greet each other with an extremely strong and enthusiastic handshake. Elric comments, laughing that his friend hasn't changed absolutely anything, while Bart jokes, saying his old boss changed so much he nearly became unrecognizable. Next, Bart greets Lady Tyria with much respect, and she answers in a quite friendly manner, wishing that he is doing well before bidding farewell. Bart invites his friend to stop by his tavern later so they can drink and chat freely. Elric accepts the invitation joyfully and promises that he will definitely pay a visit to his friend's establishment later. The young man waves in farewell while watching the young couple continue their peaceful walk through the middle of the fair. Bart thinks to himself that he never imagined the two would end up marrying, but admits they form a truly perfect couple. As the day draws to a close, the carriage follows its journey back beneath a gorgeous sky painted with the colors of the sunset. In the comfort of the vehicle, Tyria focuses on reading a book, while Elric observes her in a serene and attentive manner. Peeking a bit closer, the young master realizes that the book that so attracts his wife's attention is an encyclopedia on botany. Breaking the silence in a quite gentle manner, he catches her attention by uttering her name in a calm voice. The beautiful young lady raises her eyes from the pages out of curiosity and softly asks what her lord would like to say. In a quite sincere way, he explains that he wishes to actively help in the administration of the estate from now on and asks for her to teach him the work. He admits she carried all that heavy burden alone for far too long, and that he wants to assume his responsibilities as leader of the family, even knowing he is very late. The young man reinforces that if she guides him well in the tasks, he will certainly be useful to the family, leaving the young lady so surprised and embarrassed that she hides her flushed face behind the book. But behind the pages, she lets out a sigh of pure happiness upon realizing how much her husband has become a truly reliable and mature man, with a new determination gleaming in her eyes. She shuts the book firmly and rests it on her lap. With a confident gaze, Tyria asks in a playful way if he truly is prepared for her to be an extremely demanding teacher, just like his late father taught her to be. The young man lets out a light chuckle and answers gladly that she can be as rigorous as she deems necessary in the training. While the carriage distances itself on the Golden Road, Elric asks curious if his father truly was that rigid in his teachings, and she answers proudly that she learned everything very fast without needing to get scolded. A little later, beneath the light of a brilliant full moon in the night sky, the scene shifts to a bustling tavern located right near the Chevor frontier. Inside, the tavern was packed with people chatting and drinking joyfully. Suddenly, a person enters the establishment, catching everyone's attention by shouting in a quite arrogant way for the fools present there to listen to her. The attendant behind the counter stops what he was doing immediately, letting out a grumble of surprise at that sudden interruption. It was a young girl with long red hair and a dark cloak, who warns seriously that she will ask that question only one single time. Staring fixedly at the people, she questions firmly where the legendary sword demon known as Kasha is. Meanwhile, beneath the gorgeous light of the sunset, the story returns to the family's immense and luxurious mansion inside. The library's silence is broken only by the soft sound of a quill writing on sheets of paper. Elric observes the stack of documents beside his wife and asks, impressed, if she always needs to deal with so much paperwork like that. Receiving as an answer that this only happens in the most bustling periods of the year, Tyria hesitates for a brief moment and calls her husband with delicacy, causing him to ask for her to speak freely. She asks in a quite timid manner if he would agree to give a special speech during the festival to officially celebrate his return to the family lands. The request leaves Elric quite awkward and pensive, repeating to himself the idea of having to give a public pronouncement. At that moment, he remembers the times of war, where military leaders gave inflamed speeches calling for the violent end of all enemies on the battlefield. He recalls that in his time as the feared mercenary Kasha, he simply ignored those words of hatred and never gave the slightest importance to the speeches. The young man remembers that he was never on a stage of honor and that he never had the least intention of climbing onto one to speak to the public. After all, the true and sole reason for him to be in the middle of that bloodshed was completely different. He fought in a savage way, only because he desperately needed a target to discharge all the fury and suffering accumulated in his chest. He recalls how he advanced against his adversaries, slicing through any obstacle with certain and relentless strikes in the middle of the carnage. Acting like a true mad dog in those dark times, the young man simply eliminated anyone who crossed his path without hesitating. Thinking of all that violence, Elric questions himself with bitterness if someone with such a terrible past would have the right to speechify at a festival of peace until being awakened by his bride's voice. He quickly apologizes to Tyria, explaining with a forced smile that he ended up distracted for a brief instant by his own thoughts. Right after, he proposes a very affectionate alternative, suggesting that she make the official pronouncement while he stands right by her side to give her support. Tyria finds the idea excellent, agreeing with a sweet smile that it will be her giving the welcomes to the public at the Harvest Festival. She thinks to herself that there is no problem in waiting for the next year for him to speak, because for her, the most important of all is having her husband by her side now. On the day of the event, the beautiful lady climbs onto the stage and speeches before the entire community gathered, thanking from the bottom of her heart for the effort and dedication of each worker throughout the year. She finalizes her words with a lot of energy, inviting everyone to enjoy that great celebration party until the last second. The entire crowd goes wild and begins celebrating with shouts of extreme joy and enthusiastic applause for the start of the festivities. Tyria turns radiant to her husband and asks if they shouldn't also take a stroll to enjoy the market attractions together. While they walk arm in arm through the decorated streets, the citizens begin pointing marveled at the passage of the noble couple through the fair. A local resident approaches all friendly and offers a plate of hot, typical food for the mistress to try right after. Another man offers a mug full of cold ale so Elric can also celebrate with them. The couple thanks from their heart for the reception, so warm, and wishes a wonderful harvest festival to all the families there. But in the middle of the stroll, Tyria suddenly parts her mouth in an expression of immense surprise at something she sees just ahead. She pulls her husband's arm, excited, and points in the direction of a street artistic performance stage. On the stage, an artist announces in a loud voice the start of a rare and unmissable performance for the entire public present. He reveals in a dramatic way that the primary attraction of that afternoon will be the incredible art of sword swallowing. The artist begins shoving the metal blade straight down his throat, leaving Tyria completely jaw-dropped at that shocking scene. As soon as the act finishes with success, the young noblewoman begins applauding with much enthusiasm, finding the performance truly spectacular, but she interrupts the clapping quickly upon noticing that her husband is with a completely bored and cold expression by her side. Tyria asks if he didn't find the show interesting, and Elric merely smiles forced, saying he has already seen many swallowers before, without revealing that in his past, people used to swallow his blades for reasons much less artistic. Continuing the walk, the two end up stopping before a target knife throwing stall. The person in charge of the game recognizes the master and challenges him joyfully to a round, catching the attention of some curious children who gather to watch. He points to some apples hanging by strings and promises to deliver a special prize in case the young master manages to hit them with the throws. Elric hesitates, commenting that it's been a long time since he held a knife, but the young audience insists, excited for him to show his talent. Tyria also enters the fun with a beautiful smile on her face, encouraging her husband to participate in that diversion alongside the children. Surrendered to everyone's requests, the young man accepts the challenge and positions himself to carry out some launches under the enthusiastic shouts of the public. The stall owner asks, laughing, for the master not to get nervous, without imagining the lethal focus that flashes instantly in the red eyes of the ex-mercenary. In a fraction of a second, and with an absurd precision of combat, Elric throws the blades and pins all of them perfectly in the exact center of each of the hanging apples. The game owner stands completely frozen in terror at such master skill, while the children shout marveled at the impressive feat. Tyria also stares at her husband with wide open eyes from surprise, without managing to hide how much she found that spectacular. Upon noticing the mood of shock and the tension around him, Elric begins sweating cold from regret, thinking if he shouldn't have feigned being much worse at that game. Elric tries to mask his own talent by saying it was pure luck, and asks his wife if that clumsy attempt was enough for him not to pass shame. Tyria stands completely marveled with the performance, and says with sparkling eyes that he was incredible, looking like a true knight. Upon seeing her so excited and radiant due to the festive atmosphere of the place, the young master cracks a sincere smile of pure happiness. Right after, the stall owner extends his hand to deliver the deserved prize to the grand winner of the game. He explains joyfully that it is a special carton of eggs offered by the Merchants Guild as a reward for his impeccable aim. Elric thanks the kindness but asks to give the eggs to the children there, causing the kids to celebrate a lot. While the merchant accepts the request with a smile, Tyria observes him with deep affection and softly comments that her husband has an incredibly kind heart. The young man confesses laughing that situation made him remember his childhood, when he used to win these same cartons of eggs and was radiant upon having the luck of finding a golden egg inside one of them. Tyria lets out a hearty laugh and remembers that he ended up trading that coveted golden egg for old Herman's massive helmet, which sat so large on his head it looked more like a bucket. Elric stops immediately what he was doing and stares at her quite surprised. Asking how she could know of a story so old from his childhood, Tyria enters a panic on the spot and begins stammering, flustered, inventing the excuse that he was a troublemaker so famous in the region that the rumors about his mischief were everywhere. She hides her face flushed from shame, thinking to herself that she could never reveal the true reason behind that knowledge. In reality, she watched him from afar with much affection, since that era simply because she already dreamed of being his bride in the future. Back in the present, the young master interrupts her daydreams, calling her in a quite affectionate way. He extends his hand with a welcoming smile on his face and warns that the main party is about to start, inviting her to go together to the central square. She holds his hand with much delicacy and agrees joyfully to continue that day so special by the side of her beloved. As night falls on the packed square, the master of ceremonies raises a lit torch and announces the start of the lighting rite to kick off the night's celebrations. Bart, who is conducting the event, offers a special thanks to the presence of the young couple and flatters in a gallant way Tyria's radiant beauty that illuminates the entire celebration. The crowd bursts out laughing at the young man's spontaneity, while Elric comments amused with his wife about his old friend's unique personality. With a lot of energy, Bart calls the entire public to unite in a prayer for the continuous glory and prosperity of that thriving region. But right after, he makes a bombshell announcement, declaring that the festival will officially start with a traditional kiss ceremony between the Lord and Lady of those lands. The unexpected announcement catches the couple totally by surprise, causing the two to tremble with shame with their faces completely flushed. Tyria stands completely paralyzed and with her heart racing, repeating in mental panic if she will really have to kiss her husband in front of all those people. In the square illuminated by the fire's glow, the entire crowd anxiously awaits the special moment of the noble couple. Elric's childhood friend continues to stir up the public with his enthusiastic words of celebration and union. He reinforces the request for the couple to give start to the festive rite with the awaited public kiss before the residents. The two stare at each other completely awkward and flustered, without knowing exactly how to act under the watchful eyes of the entire fair. Seeing his boss's hesitation, Bart begins to tease him, laughing out loud and telling him to hurry up already with the kiss, causing Elric to grumble irritably against his friend's audacity. The Joker calls the entire crowd to shout very loud and give the young master the necessary courage to take action. Hundreds of voices united begin echoing in a rhythmic chant calling for the kiss, leaving the couple even more cornered by shyness. Taking a quick decision to resolve the impasse, Elric approaches his wife with seriousness and softly asks for permission. In a swift and extremely charming movement, he dips her by the waist and leans her back in an elegant way. In the middle of the square, Tyria widens her eyes from surprise at the sudden proximity of their faces, feeling her cheeks burn from so much emotion. He apologizes in a low voice, explaining with an awkward smile that he took that action only because the public wouldn't stop demanding the kiss. Otherwise, Tyria smiles with sweetness and says she understands the situation, but warns in a whisper that she herself doesn't intend to limit herself only to that bureaucratic staging. Surprising the young man totally, she pulls him with firmness by the neck and seals their lips in a deep and passionate kiss that steals his breath away. At the exact same instant that the grand bonfire is lit, illuminating the dark sky, the crowd goes wild with shouts of extreme celebration for that beautiful scene of love beneath the full moon's glow. People wish that the love of that couple be eternal and call in unison for the glory of their lands. Hours later, in the dead of the cold night, the scenery returns to the silence of the family's immense and luxurious mansion. Lying in her quarters, Tyria hides her face in the pillow and thrashes on the bed, dying of shame upon remembering the audacity she had in kissing her husband that way in front of everyone. Panting and with her cheeks red from so much shyness, she tries to regain her composure while dealing with that whirlwind of emotions in her chest. She enters a total panic upon reliving the memory of the passionate kiss, questioning herself desperately what got into her to act in that so daring way with the young master. Fearing that he now views her as a strange woman devoid of manners, the young noblewoman spends the night awake without managing to sleep from so much worry. But she is not alone in this, since in his own room, Elric also finds himself totally awake and staring at the ceiling with his face flushed while he touches his own lips pensive. Far from there, in the glorious kingdom of Armen, the scene shifts to the imposing and luxurious official residence of an important local noble. Inside the sumptuous study of the estate, a hand decorated with expensive rings delicately raises a golden and detailed teacup. The refined man takes a slow sip of his drink with total peace, maintaining a posture of extreme elegance and power. Before him, a silver-haired subordinate delivers a serious report, informing President White that the forces of the Imperial Army managed to successfully breach the frontier defense lines. Placing the cup back on the saucer with a dry click, the leader comments with disdain that the enemies are collapsing without any resistance since the feared mercenary Kasha abandoned the battlefield. With a cold smile of pure satisfaction, the influential Duke Edward celebrates the efficacy of his plan to steer the war hero away from combat, consolidating thus his strategic victory. By his side, his cold secretary Agnes Blackmire listens to the Duke's words with a composed and attentive posture. However, she displays worry and questions if it is truly prudent to let those two important regions fall into the hands of the enemy army without doing anything. He takes another sip of tea and explains that that war already extends for 7 years and that those regions only survived for so long financed by the kingdom thanks to the hero, Kasha. He adds coldly that those territories have already completely lost any financial capacity to pay the astronomical debts accumulated. The Duke argues that, without Kasha to protect them, the lands will inevitably collapse, and all they need to do before that is pull out their primary allies and bail out their shares. Agnes extends her hand to hold the gold teapot and serve more tea to her astute superior. While serving the drink, the secretary comments with a sharp gaze that the Duke is a truly relentless man in his businesses. Edward makes a funny pose of being offended and complains about that comment, claiming he is only fulfilling his natural duty as a noble protector of the kingdom, ignoring his staging. The secretary adopts a serious tone and asks if it is really safe to let the terrifying warrior Kasha live in peace without any surveillance. Edward flashes a peaceful smile and answers that that ruthless warrior doesn't exist anymore, since now he answers only by the common name of Elric Portman. She simulates a shot against her own temple and alerts about the imminent risk of a violent revenge case he recovers totally, questioning if it wouldn't have been safer to put a bullet in his head right at the start. The noble reminds her of the absurd skill of the ex-mercenary, recalling when he managed to deflect a supersonic bullet in mid-flight using a mana shield in the blink of an eye. Even while having his legs destroyed, he concludes saying it would have been a waste to kill him, because keeping him alive under those conditions ended up serving perfectly their plans to weaken the enemy defenses. The Duke explains that, despite seeming similar for acting as mercenaries focused on results, there exists a crucial and very striking difference between the character of the two. He reveals that Elric simply doesn't act thinking only of personal gain or his own financial benefits, which is an extremely rare virtue for someone of his circle. Precisely from knowing this nobility of spirit of the young man, the Duke confesses with a dark gaze that he decided to keep Elric completely under his control and absolute control of his actions. Edward explains that, without the legendary warrior on the front, the combat will soon enter an impasse, and all the kingdoms desperate for military financing will come begging for resources at the door of his economic group. The secretary comprehends the brilliant move and adds that, by controlling Kasha's destiny, the Duke can dictate the balance of the entire war and accumulate a fortune even more gigantic for his corporation. Hearing that analysis so perfect makes the young master crack a sincere smile of pure happiness. He points at her very enthusiastic with her intelligence. The blonde approaches quickly with open arms, asking for a hug to celebrate that partnership so successful. But his advance is abruptly cut short by a heavy punch that strikes him right in the face. The secretary coldly warns him not to try any funny business and makes clear she won't go easy just because he is young, while he cries from pain fallen on the floor. The day breaks sunny, and the sunlight shines over the imposing facade of the Portman family mansion. In front of the mirror, Rhonda adjusts with care Elric's suit and asks if the outfit is comfortable or too tight. Receiving the young man's confirmation that everything is great, Elric walks in the direction of the exit, accompanied by the headmaid, but the two interrupt their stride immediately upon seeing Tyria approaching in the hallway. Upon running face-to-face with her husband so well-dressed, the beautiful bride turns totally flushed and whispers his name in a quite timid and bashful way. Elric also feels his chest race from nerves and stares back at her with his cheeks flushed. Without knowing right what to say, after the previous night's kiss, Rhonda notices on the spot that strong romantic tension in the air and smiles amused, trying to make Tyria complete what she was going to say before freezing from shyness. Defeated by extreme embarrassment, Tyria turns halfway, running in panic down the mansion's hallway under the disbelieving gaze of the headmaid. Elric merely looks away and scratches the back of his neck, totally awkward at that sudden flight of his beloved intrigata. Rhonda asks if the two ended up having some silly argument, commenting that she had turned very happy upon hearing the rumors that the mood between them was super romantic at the festival. The young man gestures nervously and tries to explain himself, flushed, claiming everything was the fault of Bart's heavy teasing that didn't give him another option but to take a drastic action on the stage. Trying desperately to escape that so intimate subject, he clears his throat and asks who the official visitors arriving at the estate today are. The head maid returns to the professional tone and informs that an important commercial delegation coming directly from the Western Kingdoms is about to disembark on their lands. Upon hearing the mention of the West, the young master's expression changes instantly to a gaze of deep worry and alert. She explains, all smiling, that the wheat produced in the Wibben region is extremely valued in the market, and that, in this year, even the powerful kingdom of Armen resolved to enter the commercial dispute for the harvests. The ex-mercenary enters maximum alert, fearing complete disaster in case someone from that delegation recognizes him as the legendary Kasha and brings dangerous enemies and conflicts to his family's lands. Rhonda suggests that, although Tyria used to take care of this before, it would be ideal for him to go personally to receive the envoys this time, to assume his role as leader, receiving the immediate agreement of the young master sometime later, already at the bustling Wibben train station. The butler Aldio notices his master's tension and asks in a sympathetic way for him not to get too nervous. The loyal employee guarantees that it's enough to do the formal greetings of nobility, that he taught him for everything to run perfectly well. Receiving a sincere thank you from the young man, Elric tries to calm down. Thinking rationally that no soldier who survived Kasha's fury on the front line would come to a peaceful province just to negotiate grain shipments, he subtly touches a combat blade hidden inside his elegant overcoat, hoping from the bottom of his chest not to have any reason to use it at that reception. The loud sound of the iron whistle announces the triumphant arrival of the great locomotive that brings the awaited foreign negotiators to the platform. The doors of the iron vehicle open at once, and the elegant shoes of the representatives begin descending the steps to the ground. Bowing with the most perfect elegance and posture of a true lord, Elric gives the official welcomes to all the members of the business delegation to his lands. He notes cordially that there are already luxury carriages waiting to take them to the mansion, but suddenly freezes from shock upon focusing his vision on one of the faces of the delegation. An elderly man with mustaches belonging to the group of merchants lets out a sigh of pure horror and panic upon recognizing the figure before him. He focuses his gaze on the man, and his feared red eyes of a warrior shine intensely for a brief moment at the train station. Completely pale from terror and trembling in an uncontrolled way, the envoy stammers in a terrified way upon asking if he is really the legendary and ruthless Kasha. Back at the luxurious palace in Whitewick, Edward White reacts with extreme surprise and asks in a loud voice who exactly just arrived at the residence. He runs all flustered through the grand hallways by the side of his secretary Agnes, grumbling that his own older sister hadn't warned absolutely anything about that sudden visit. With much excitement, the young duke flings open the grand double doors of the noble parlor of his property. He extends his arms with a grin from ear to ear and shouts joyfully for the name of his beloved sister Ygritte. But in response to his enthusiasm, what he receives is an extremely cold and intimidating glare of sharp red eyes. Seated on the sofa with her arms crossed in an imposing way, there reveals herself the powerful Ygritte Valentina, known as the Flameflower, and primary majority shareholder of the group. Ignoring her sour face, Edward hoists her into the air with enthusiasm and comments all affectionately that she seems to have grown even more since the last time they saw each other. Irritated by that physical approach, the girl commands him to put her on the ground immediately before she ends up burning him alive right there. sensing the real danger of the threat. The young man quickly obeys with a forced smile and sweating from nerves. Without patience for stalling, she asks directly if he finally managed to discover the whereabouts of the mercenary Kasha. Calling out that it's already been days since her request, Edward turns extremely flustered and tries to apologize, explaining that that man is like a ghost and that it is being incredibly difficult to track him. Furious at his incompetence, Ygritte grabs him by his clothes and begins to bellow, threatening to pull out all her shares from the company case. He doesn't find the sword demon, making the brother beg desperate for her not to do that. She pinches her brother's cheek with force and orders that if he really wants to maintain the partnership, he must bring that wretch of Kasha to her, or at least find out where he hides. With the orders given, the girl spins on her heels, making her long, dark cloak float through the air with elegance. She casts one last, quite serious and composed look sideways, leaving clear she is not joking. She warns coldly that she won't give him much time and demands that, at minimum, he find out soon the exact location of the mercenary before withdrawing from the room. The grand double doors of the parlor close with a heavy bang, leaving behind a tense mood in the meeting room. Kneeling on the ground and recovering from the scare, the Duke answers Agnes's question, stating he would never reveal Kasha's whereabouts to her, since an unimaginable disaster would happen, case the two crossed paths. Regaining his serious and focused posture from before, the young businessman changes the subject and asks if the commercial delegation has already been sent to the lands of Wibben. Agnes confirms it has, but displays a certain doubt whether the ex-warrior Kasha would really bite that commercial bait they prepared to lure him back. Edward cracks a quite confident and astute smile, stating that the leader Elric Portman won't have another choice but to accept, since he prepared a financial proposal that is simply impossible to be refused. Meanwhile, the story returns to the train that cuts through the beautiful golden fields beneath the bright light of day. Inside one of the passenger cars, the members of the commercial delegation travel maintaining a quite tense and apprehensive silence. The men trade subtle and serious looks, while the swaying of the iron vehicle dictates the slow pace of their journey. The oldest leader of the delegation stares at the space before him in a pensive and silent way, composed in his own plans. The locomotive finally parks at the bustling platform of the town, indicating the end of that long journey. The illustrious passengers begin disembarking from the train one by one. Being received by the local team, Elric makes his formal and elegant greeting as head of the family, giving the official welcomes to the visitors in a very polished way. But in the middle of his cordial words of welcome, the young master freezes completely upon focusing his red eyes on one of the men of the delegation. The merchant with mustaches lets out a deep sigh of pure panic upon recognizing right away that striking face before him. Elric's sharp and threatening gaze crosses directly with the startled eyes of the visitor on the platform. The man begins sweating from terror and stammers in an uncontrolled way before that so overwhelming presence. The other companions hold the man who seems to be on the verge of fainting from panic, while Elric laments internally for having the bad luck of crossing precisely with that person at that moment. He knows perfectly that if his true identity of a war hero is exposed there, the entire region of Wibben will run a mortal danger, so he needs to hide who he is at any cost, Polo shouts in desperation, wanting to turn halfway and return to the train immediately, but Elric resolves to take the initiative to bypass the misunderstanding with class. The young master lets out a very casual laugh and introduces himself formally only as Elric Portman, the current leader of the local family, leaving even the butler Aldio confused with that reaction. The merchant with mustaches turns totally confused by that so mild and friendly posture, asking himself if that man with a cane really isn't the feared warrior of the past. Elric extends his hand worried and asks in a mild way if he is feeling well, causing the man to conclude, relieved that a fellow so simple and silly could never be the true and relentless Kasha. After all, the terrifying memory he carries of the sword demon from 5 years ago was completely different from a nobleman so polite. He recalls with terror the day the young Elric delivered a violent slap directly to his face in the middle of a sumptuous ballroom. The blow made the man collapse in a humiliating way on the floor, before the whispers and shocked looks of the entire aristocracy gathered. All the noble guests began whispering, horrified at that scene of such violence and breach of social protocol. Fallen on the floor and trembling with rage, the merchant bellowed furious, asking how a mere commoner without a known lineage dared to commit such an offense against a noble of his importance. But without displaying the least fear, the young mercenary began removing his combat gloves slowly, staring at the man with a look of pure contempt and coldness. without giving any chance for explanations. He delivered a certain slap to Polo's face, using the glove itself to formalize a challenge. He declared in a loud and firm voice that offense to his honor would be resolved in the only way possible, challenging him to a duel to the death right there. Forced to accept, so as not to lose his dignity, the merchant shouted enraged for the guards to bring 2 swords to give a lesson in etiquette to that insolent brat. But before the combat started, a familiar voice surfaced suddenly, telling everyone to stop with that madness immediately. Elric turned his face with disdain to see who the meddler was who was getting in the way of the start of his honor duel. It was his former employer in the wheelchair, who began begging sincere apologies to Polo in the name of his undisciplined subordinate. But the merchant answered furious that it was already too late for apologies. Lord Graham, worried about the consequences of that fight, reprimands Kasha and demands that he lower his head and beg apologies immediately to Lord Polo. Back in the present, Polo remembers with terror that the feared sword demon was someone whose path no one should cross, much less make an enemy of the memory of that young, relentless warrior, with red eyes staring at him with contempt, still makes the merchant tremble with fear beneath his blanket. Trying to compose himself on the platform, Polo concludes he must have only exaggerated in his reaction, accepts Elric's reception in a nervous way, and suggests they continue the route. While walking by the young man's side, the merchant curses mentally against Kasha, irritated that ghost of the past still haunts him in his thoughts. Noticeably catching the guest's obvious tension, Elric casts a quite serious and composed look from the corner of his eye toward him. The carriage transporting the commercial delegation follows its journey through the dirt roads beneath the orange light of a beautiful sunset. Sometime later, the driver warns the passengers they are about to arrive at the property and can already get ready to step down. Tyria, accompanied by her maids and by her own husband, waits on the outside to give the official welcomes to the visitors. With a very friendly and welcoming smile, she introduces herself as Tyria Portman and says it is an honor to receive the important representatives of the Western powers. Noticing their fatigue, the young lady suggests that the priority now be to rest a bit to recover from the long and exhausting trip. Tyria then asks for the head maid Rhonda to guide the entire delegation to their respective rooms, and she obeys promptly with a respectful nod. When night finally falls over the mansion beneath a starry sky, someone knocks in a soft way on the door of one of the guest rooms. Relaxing comfortably in an armchair with lighter clothes, Polo asks himself, irritated, who would be bothering at that hour of the night. The mysterious person enters the room with slow and firm steps, grumbling in a low voice about the situation. The merchant begins saying he doesn't need any room service and asks not to be bothered, but freezes upon noticing who just entered. Elric stares at him in an extremely cold way and warns that it doesn't concern room service, but that unfortunately he will need to bother Lord Polo. Panic takes over the merchant in such a way that he completely loses his balance and crashes on his bottom on the floor from pure shock. Trembling with terror, Polo points his finger and shouts that scary look confirms he is really the feared sword demon. From the outside of the grand mansion, it is possible to hear the echo of the man's desperation upon having absolute certainty about the true identity of his host. Before that inevitable revelation, Elric admits it doesn't make sense to keep hiding the truth and assumes that he really is Kasha Polo, backs away startled across the floor, asking what he wants and reminding him desperate that he already begged apologies for the occurrence years ago. Elric settles down peacefully in an armchair and asks if he is referring to the day he insulted him and his family in the ballroom. With a calm voice and a composed look, the young master adds that he doesn't remember accepting those apologies. At the time, Elric asks if the guest intends to keep thrown on the floor and invites him to sit down so the two can chat calmly about business. The young master reminds Polo that the true reason for his trip there was to negotiate the wheat produced on the lands of Wibben. Now, much calmer, the two sit face to face in the luxurious parlor, ready to give start to a serious business conversation. Even seated comfortably, Polo still feels visibly uncomfortable and nervous before Kasha's imposing presence. Elric breaks the ice of the conversation, revealing that before going there, he had a very interesting meeting with Lord Ugil. Surprised by the revelation, the merchant asks what the other man said, and Elric answers simply that he received a commercial proposal from him. Elric remembers the moment he questioned if their goal was really to buy the entire wheat production of the Wibben province. Ugil confirmed the intention with an astute smile, explaining that all the bought wheat would be distributed through the western region under the responsibility of the Kingdom of Armen. The gray-haired man added that a good percentage of the commission fees generated during the distribution would be destined directly to the Portman family. However, he imposed the sole and rigid condition that the entire stock of wheat should be sold exclusively to the Kingdom of Armen. With a conspiratorial look, the visitor said he trusted Elric's good judgment to accept a proposal so lucrative. He finalized his play, displaying a lot of confidence that the young master would close the deal without hesitating. Upon hearing about the rival's plans, Polo totally loses his composure and slams his hand with force on the table, cursing Armin's representatives. Extremely furious, the merchant rants that they were plotting behind their backs the entire time and calls Ugiel a lying traitor. Capitalizing on the guest's moment of rage, Elric suggests calmly that they make a commercial deal directly between the two, surprising Polo. The young master confirms and says the business would be to sell the entire stock for the same generous value that the rival kingdom had proposed initially. Polo turns hesitant and explains that, although he is the supply officer of the Empire, he doesn't have the authority to approve a price so high on his own. Elric then suggests placing the official acceptance of the past apologies as part of the deal, clearing for good any grudge between them. Silence takes over the room, while the merchant, quite tense and sweaty, ponders carefully over that unrefusable proposal. Polo tries to negotiate and suggests closing the deal for 60% of the value proposed by Armin, but Elric counters, saying such a large discount would be problematic for his family. Sensing the pressure of the sword demon's gaze, the officer gulps hard and realizes he doesn't have much margin to insist on a low value. He then raises the offer to 70% and adds that the Empire will cover all shipping costs and customs duties of the operation. Elric makes a firm counter-proposal of 75%, maintaining the same conditions of tax exemption offered by the merchant. Without thinking twice, Polo accepts the new terms, and the two seal the important deal with a firm handshake. Satisfied with the outcome, Elric praises the negotiation and says the guest must be the first to manage to close a deal of this level against the Empire's interests. Before withdrawing, Polo can't hold his curiosity and asks why, in the middle of so many people, the young man chose to do business precisely with him. Elric thinks to himself that he chose to do business with Polo simply because he seemed like the easiest target out of all the negotiators there. But since he would never say that out loud, he merely brushes it off by saying that, despite the reunion being a bit tense, that is a good opportunity for them to overcome the past, which makes Polo let out a laugh of pure relief. Next, the young master warns that he has just one more important request to make, leaving the merchant with mustaches quite curious and helpful. Elric alerts in a very serious way that, case any rumor surfaces after today saying that the sword demon was seen on the lands of Wibben, their contract will be summarily rewritten in blood, and asks with a dark and scary look if the guest understood perfectly the warning. Taken by an indescribable dread, the man gulps hard and shakes his head in a frenetic way, agreeing without thinking twice to save his own skin. On the following day, all the members of the delegation and the host gather around a grand round table to formalize the business. Tyria announces with a beautiful smile that, before all the presented conditions, the Portman family will officially close the trade agreement with the Imperial Army. Elric accompanies his wife, clapping discreetly, quite satisfied to see that the plan crafted by them worked perfectly. One of the other merchants of the delegation congratulates Polo on the success in the negotiation, and he thanks back, trying to mask the extreme nervousness he still feels. Suddenly, Lord Ugiel slams his hand with force on the meeting table and shouts, outraged that commercial decision makes no sense. He demands explanations from Tyria in a very rude way, asking if she didn't hear his proposal, but she answers calmly that everything was decided according to her husband's will. Furious at the refusal, he questions if she has a notion of how absurd that commercial swap is, calling her Miss, but she soon interrupts him, saying the correct way is to call her Madam. The gray-haired man freezes completely for an instant, caught by surprise with that correction so firm and unexpected in the middle of his complaint. With much elegance and pride, she introduces herself formally as Tyria Portman, the legitimate wife of the leader who is right there by her side. She adds in a well-cold way that it is a tremendous lack of manners on the part of an envoy to insist on using the wrong title with her, addressing directly Lord Edmund Ugiel. Without a way out and visibly flustered before everyone, the man swallows his own pride and begs formal apologies to Lady Portman. Upon seeing his arrogant colleague be put in his proper place, Polo can't hold himself and lets out a very subtle laugh to mock the situation. Elric also gives a low sigh of satisfaction upon seeing how his wife handled with total mastery the petulance of that unwanted guest. He rests his hands with firmness over his cane of dark metal, feeling that tense meeting finally reached its end. Already on the outside part of the estate, the young lord orders his personal guards to escort the entire delegation in total safety back to the train station. From inside the transport vehicle, Polo waves back with a look much more peaceful, holding firm the precious trade contract he just signed. Elric returns the wave with his head in a quite serious way, guaranteeing silently that the deal between the two is maintained. Together, the couple observes in silence the carriage pull away down the golden road beneath the blue and sunny sky. Elric smiles and confesses to his wife that he has passed to view her under a new perspective. Very impressed with the firm attitude she displayed before the negotiators, Tyria merely closes her eyes with delicacy and answers with simplicity that she only spoke the truth to that man who thought himself superior. Next, she jokes, saying her husband also showed himself an extremely astute and intelligent negotiator, leaving him half flustered with the compliment. She reveals that Polo handed her the contract papers and that the real terms were much better than those announced publicly, proving that Weben came out winning a lot from that negotiation. Half awkward, he admits he only wanted to hurt the pride of that envoy from Armen who behaved in an arrogant way, receiving the congratulations of his wife for the excellent result. Satisfied with the outcome of that day so bustling, Tyria suggests that the two head back into the mansion, and the young master agrees immediately. Meanwhile, well far from there, the grand banner with the coat of arms of the White Group sways in an imposing way against the cloudy sky. The story then shifts to the sumptuous private residence where the headquarters of the influential merchant group of Edward White sits suddenly. A thunderous shout of pure rage and deep frustration echoes from inside the sumptuous mansion. Crossing the massive decorated double doors, Edward runs desperate through the luxurious hallways of the place, grabbing his own blonde hair without managing to understand how his perfect plan failed. He complains in tears that he offered to buy the entire wheat for an excellent price and even split the distribution profits, without comprehending why the leader of Weben refused such an offer. He rants that the young man only needed to accept and reap the fruits of the partnership in a simple way, while Agnes, with her usual cold expression, asks for her boss to try and calm down. Edward continues his drama, throwing himself back in a very exaggerated way, lamenting that the young man ruined all his brilliant commercial plans. But in this moment of pure physical drama, the young blonde's foot ends up slipping for real on the polished floor of the hallway. He completely loses his balance and begins falling backward in a quite clumsy way in the middle of the empty hallway. However, a firm and fast hand surfaces right in time to grab his before he ends up hurting himself bad in the fall. The young entrepreneur widens his eyes from surprise upon realizing he was caught in the air well before touching the ground. Agnes holds him in a very firm and protective way, in her arms, acting with speed to save her boss from a domestic accident. She puts him on his feet with total ease and delicacy, displaying a physical strength out of the ordinary for a regular assistant. Quite impatient, the assistant reprimands the boss for not maintaining his calm like she asked, and he apologizes with a half-awkward smile. Shortly after, in a reserved room, a hot and aromatic tea is served to help tranquilize the thoughts of the blonde entrepreneur. Agnes asks if he finally managed to calm down a bit, and he thanks from his heart for the tea and for all the help of his loyal protector. Regaining his seriousness from before, Edward ponders that, remembering the era when the young man acted as Kasha, he never expected him to do business with the Empire, which completely broke his expectations. With her habitual practicality, Agnes suggests that, to discover the real intentions of someone who acts in a strange way, the best alternative sometimes is simply to ask directly. Edward stays in silence for a brief instant, agreeing that the only viable way out to resolve that doubt will be to go there and question the young man personally. With this important decision taken in a definitive way, the young leader extends his hand to open the drawer of his desk to grab the necessary documents. Edward opens the drawer of his work desk with a quite determined and serious expression on his face. He stares at a gorgeous golden pistol stored in there and comments they will certainly need a proper means of conversation for this reunion with the ex-warrior. Meanwhile, the story shifts to the sumptuous official residence of the prominent family of Elvis Graham. Graham gives a warm welcome to Polo, commenting on his recent return trip, but the merchant interrupts him anxious and asks him to take a look at a document first. Graham receives the small scroll of paper in a quite intrigued way and wonders what that would be. Polo reveals that it concerns a letter sent personally by Elric Portman, causing the nobleman in the wheelchair to repeat the name with surprise. With much care, Graham opens the handwritten correspondence to discover what the gist of the young man's message is. He reads in an extremely attentive way each of the written lines, maintaining a quite pensive and composed posture. But to Polo's total surprise, Graham suddenly lets out a loud and uncontrolled laugh at what he just read in the letter. He keeps gargling with much will, covering his own face with one of his gloved hands from so much amusing himself with the content sent by the young man. Laughing, Graham comments that he finally understood who that young master was and says Polo must have taken the biggest scare upon running face-to-face with the terrifying Kasha, which the merchant confirms, saying he nearly fainted from dread. In a very good mood, the noble sincerely thanks the visitor for having delivered to him personally that so important correspondence. Polo bids farewell, saying his duty there is fulfilled and that he is already leaving, while Graham wishes him an excellent and safe return trip. Alone, Graham murmurs Kasha's name in a nostalgic way, remembering his sudden disappearance and observing that winter must already be arriving in the lands of Wibben by that time of the year. Time passes, and the story returns to Wibben, where the beautiful golden landscapes now begin to be covered by a thin layer of cold snow. In the middle of a dense frozen forest, the sound of a shotgun blast echoes strong and breaks the region's silence. A young local hunter celebrates excited with his companions for having hit dead on the great target he chased so much. The boys walk happy to the massive stag fallen in the snow, celebrating that with that beautiful prey, they will finally stop being mere apprentice hunters. While two of them debate over the work it will give to drag the animal and think of bringing the horses, the third hunter freezes suddenly upon feeling a strange and scary chill. The companion asks for him to stop staying still there, mouth gaping, and go fetch the animals soon, but the young man doesn't even answer from how startled he is with that bad feeling. Instead of answering, he places his index finger in front of his lips in a hurried way, signaling for the friends to make absolute silence immediately. Extremely tense, he orders that the two back away immediately from the prey they just brought down, leaving the other hunters completely confused with that sudden attitude. He explains he is feeling a freezing and very dangerous presence nearby, similar to that of a terrifying magical beast, and insists they need to flee from there soon. The others mock the warning, saying that monster story has no grace at all and that it's obvious it is cold because they are in the middle of winter. But before the discussion continues, a gigantic, monstrous paw surfaces out of nowhere and falls with force right by their side, throwing the young men to the ground covered in dread. Desperate, the hunter points his weapon at the creature and shouts desperate for the companions to get immediately out of the path. A gigantic lupine beast surfaces from behind the frozen trees, emitting a scary growl that makes the hunters tremble on the ground from pure fear. The monstrous creature of glowing blue eyes and extremely sharp fangs roars with fury before the young men who invaded its territory. Back at the Portman mansion, the climate outside continues quite frozen with the snow falling without stopping over the residence's roof. Inside one of the luxurious living rooms, Tyria listens with much attention and deep worry to the scary account brought by the young men. The three surviving hunters admit, downcast, they fled, running in absolute panic upon realizing the crushing strength of the monster they faced. Displaying much compassion, the young lady thanks their courage, offers a hot tea to calm them, and promises she will discuss the subject with her husband so that the problem is resolved. She then asks for the headmaid Rhonda to serve hot meals and drinks to the injured boys, and the employee obeys promptly with a respectful nod. Meanwhile, in the mansion's private library, the butler Aldio removes from the shelves an old and quite thick book about creatures and monsters. He walks by Tyria's side, analyzing the facts, and explains that, crossing the hunters' depositions with the official records of the encyclopedia, they already have a strong hunch about the creature. The feared magical beast that invaded their territory seems to be a terrifying and relentless blade wolf. Tyria turns apprehensive upon hearing talk of a monster of those, while Aldio ponders that that species of beast should have vanished completely after the death of its old leader a long time ago. The butler recalls with regret that the original leader of that pack was precisely the beast that left that deep scar on Elric's neck in a terrible battle in the past. Upon remembering all the suffering and the painful scars her husband carries on his body until today, Tyria's determination grows intensely. She declares in a firm way that, regardless of being a monster or not, she won't allow any inhabitant of her lands to run the same mortal danger her husband faced, and orders the creation of a hunting party to eliminate the beast. Aldio agrees respectfully with the order and promises to recruit immediately the best and most skilled elite hunters of the region for the mission. Before the butler withdraws from the library, the young lady calls him back to give one more very important and confidential instruction. With a serious and worried countenance, she asks that that entire hunting plan be kept in absolute secret from her husband. Aldio stands momentarily surprised with the request for secrecy, but guarantees he will act with total discretion and keep the hunting plan entirely hidden. Shortly after, Elric's carriage is already properly prepared outside the grand estate for one more trip of his. The young lord smiles and warns he will return shortly from his commercial chores outside the province, and Tyria returns in an affectionate way, wishing him a good trip. Together, the staff and the lady observe in silence the young man's carriage pull away by degrees down the road covered in snow. Aldio expresses a certain worry and asks if it wouldn't be better to warn the boss, but Tyria ponders that, knowing his stubbornness, the young man would insist on fighting personally even with his injured leg. She looks at the horizon in a very pensive way, fearing he ends up hurting himself seriously again like happened in the past. She recalls with deep sadness the day when, still in childhood, she shouted desperate for his name while watching him depart to face mortal dangers. In that painful memory of the past, the young Elric placed himself courageously between the giant beast and the little girl, wielding only a piece of wood to protect her. Tyria reinforces she can't allow her husband to run danger again and asks if the special preparations she asked are already totally ready. Receiving the butler's confirmation, Aldio presents with pride the elite hunters he recruited personally inside the family lands, all very well equipped and ready for the mission. Satisfied, she says they must finish eliminating the monster before Elric's return, but Aldio enters a panic upon realizing she intends to accompany the hunting group personally. With much dignity, the young lady explains that, since those people are going to a dangerous place under her orders, accompanying them close is the duty she needs to fulfill as a noble. Without managing to make her change her mind, the butler accepts the decision with reluctance, but imposes the rigid condition that she retreat immediately at the least sign of the monster. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to the bustling and frozen commercial district of Wibben, which is entirely covered by a thick layer of snow inside one of the local medical clinics. Someone lets out a low and contained grumble of pain while passing through a consultation. The doctor with glasses examines Elric's leg and comments with a friendly smile that the recovery is excellent and that he can already consider himself cured. Elric asks if he can already finally stop using his bothersome metal cane, but the doctor advises to maintain it for a bit more time only out of extreme precaution. The doctor then directs his gaze to the scar on the young man's neck and asks in a professional way if that terrible injury of the past left any sequel. Elric smiles in a very friendly way and praises the professional, saying he feels nothing thanks to the excellent treatment made by a doctor so renowned. The doctor recalls the difficulties of that treatment, explaining that blade wolf bites cause serious frostbite burns and revealing how his late father begged desperate for him to save his son's life. Elric stands completely shocked with the revelation, murmuring surprised if his severe father really had done all that for him in the past. The old man smiles from the corner of his mouth and says it was a striking scene, because it was the first time in all his professional life that he saw the countenance of that strong man turn pale from pure fear. Elric gives a sad and pensive smile, admitting that for him it is somewhat difficult to imagine his severe father demonstrating a reaction so vulnerable and full of love. The experienced doctor bids farewell to the young lord, reinforcing the advice for him to avoid making any kind of exaggerated physical effort in the next days. Shortly after, the clinic's wooden doors open, and the young lord steps out to the street covered in snow to return home. Elric walks slowly using his cane when he spots a mysterious man with crossed arms leaning against the wall waiting for him. The stranger asks with a friendly smile if the medical consultation ran well, calling him by his full name and catching the young man's attention right away. Elric stops in the middle of the path, looks well at his face, and asks a bit surprised if he is really Luton. Luton opens a massive grin from ear to ear and celebrates that his old captain and great childhood friend finally returned to the lands of Wibben. The two friends hug with much strength and joy, and Luton counts that he came running as soon as he received the correspondence sent by him. Elric comments that he heard the rumors that he had joined the Royal Knights, and Luton displays with immense pride his brilliant sword granted directly by the court. The knight suggests they stop staying there in the cold and go to a warmed place to drink and chat, and Elric accepts excited, saying the round of drinks is on his account. But before they can take the first step, a messenger from the town arrives running and shouting by the knight's name, who complains, saying that that is his day off. The youth extends the rolled document with haste and explains in an offaganty way that it concerns an urgent call for help sent by the Portman family itself. Both Luton and Elric widen their eyes in deep shock, without comprehending right away what the meaning of that request for help is. The messenger stammers quite startled and reveals that the problem involves directly the young lady Tyria Portman. He completes the report saying she was attacked by a terrifying magical beast in the forest, making Elric's eyes glow with pure hatred and desperation. Meanwhile, in the middle of the frozen mountains of the region, the sound of intense firearm shots echoes in a violent way through the snow. Two massive lupine beasts run furious through the forest in search of the human preys who dared to invade their hunting territory. One of the fearless elite hunters discharges his shotgun against the beasts to contain their relentless advance and cover the flight of the others. The shot launched hits dead on the head of one of the blade wolves, causing the monster to howl from pain and hesitate for a brief instant. The hunters shout for everyone to shoot with care and guarantee they will protect Tyria and her young maid Marie, who run without stopping to save themselves. In the middle of the desperate run, Marie points relieved to an old abandoned wooden cabin right in the middle of the forest covered in snow. The two enter running into the rustic shelter with all the speed possible to find protection against the snowstorm and the danger that stalks them. On the outside, the hunter's leader orders in a loud voice for his companions to light the magical stones of blue light to catch the monster's attention. They run in the opposite direction, holding the glowing stones, knowing that the magical energy released by them will attract the beast's attention and keep them well far from the cabin. The distraction plan works perfectly, and the beasts begin following the blue lights through the forest, pulling away from the place where the lady is hidden. Protected temporarily inside the dark and cold cabin, Tyria and Marie cover themselves with heavy blankets to try and resist the rigorous cold of the storm. Feeling very guilty for the situation, Tyria begs sincere apologies for placing the young maid in such size danger, but Marie asks gently for her not to worry about that. With a determined countenance, the girl asks for her to hold tight just a bit more, remembering she sent a trusted messenger to call a rescue group. Despite the danger, Tyria cracks a mild smile and comments she is very relieved to have kept the subject a secret from her husband, happy not to place him at risk again. Quite emotional with the kindness and with the immense worry of her mistress, Marie cannot contain the tears that begin streaming down her face. Meanwhile, Elric and Luton ride desperately with their horses through the frozen plains beneath a strong and relentless blizzard. The young lord asks himself anxious why his beloved wife took an attitude so dangerous alone, questioning himself if he is truly someone so little reliable to her eyes. Catching the obvious agony of his friend, Luton shouts, calling him by his old title of captain, and asks for him to try and maintain his calm, guaranteeing he will save Tyria in any way. Elric launches a look of immense gratitude to his loyal childhood friend and thanks in a very sincere way for the support in that so desperate moment. The current situation brings to the young man's mind a very vivid memory of the past, when Luton ran desperate to help him while Tyria cried without stopping from pure fear. In that memory of his childhood, little Elric continued standing with firmness, facing the giant beast to protect his friend from danger. Little Luton apologized desperate and shouted he would fetch help immediately before running off through the forest. Determined with the memories of the past, the now knight Luton promises mentally that he will never let his great friend fight alone again. At a distance, one of the elite hunters spots their rapid approach on horseback and shouts to catch the attention of the two young men. Elric steps down rapidly from his horse and runs ahead in the direction of the hunter, leaving Luton a bit behind on the road. Extremely anxious, the young master holds the hunter by his shoulders and asks for Tyria's whereabouts, receiving the answer that she managed to shelter in a wooden cabin close by there. However, the youth explains anxious that his companions ended up staying totally isolated after attracting the monsters far away to guarantee her safety. Without hesitating a single second even, Elric asks to be guided to the location of the combat, stating he will rescue the hunters in danger. But Luton places his hand on his friend's shoulder and says in a firm way that he won't do that. This time, Luton says he himself will take care of the rescue of the hunters and insists for Elric to run to protect his wife, although the young man demonstrates worry from dealing with blade wolves. Luton opens a very confident smile and guarantees he is no longer that little cowardly boy he knew. In the times of childhood, Elric smiles back with affection and agrees, recognizing that now his old adventure's companion turned into a true and honored knight. Without losing time, the knight orders the hunter to guide him to the other arms companions, and the two depart running through the snowy forest. Knowing exactly what he needs to do, Elric focuses all his attention on arriving as fast as possible to where his beloved wife is hidden. The young lord runs with quite a bit of difficulty in the middle of the strong snowstorm that lashes the entire forest of Wyben. His feet sink deeply into the fluffy snow that covers the ground, but he refuses permanently to slacken the pace of his run. Quite worried about everyone's safety and irritated with the amount of monsters that invaded the region, he continues advancing against the cold wind. Suddenly, he raises his gaze and spots with immense relief the wooden structure of the old cabin right ahead of him. He flings open the cabin door at once, entering the dark room with his heart racing from worry, desperate to find her safe and sound. He shouts Tyria's name at full lungs as soon as he steps inside the shelter. Protected in the back of the room, Tyria and Marie look in absolute shock at the door, without believing that the young master really appeared there to fetch them. Without saying any word, Elric advances at rapid and determined steps in the direction of his wife across the wooden floor. He pulls her to an extremely tight and emotion-filled hug, leaving even young Marie a bit flustered with the scene. With her cheeks very flushed, Tyria asks surprised why he made all that dangerous and frozen path just to find her. In response, the young master merely presses her even stronger against his chest, without wanting to release her for nothing in this world. He backs away a bit, holds her firm by her shoulders, and complains, saying he should make that question, wanting to know why she did something so risky without speaking to him before. With a low and quite embarrassed look, the blonde confesses timidly that she acted like this only because she didn't want to place him in danger again. Elric stares at her in a quite hurt way and asks with a mild voice if she really trusts so little like that in his abilities to protect her. Tyria tries to explain herself, saying it was nothing of that, but is interrupted when the young man hugs her again with much affection and protection. He says softly that he is immensely relieved to see her safe and asks for her to promise never more to get into a dangerous situation alone from now on. Feeling her husband's immense love, Tyria rests her face on his shoulder and promises with affection that she will never do that again. In the corner of the cabin, young Marie watches that beautiful demonstration of affection with a massive smile on her face and tears of happiness. Suddenly, the two hear sounds of heavy footsteps approaching rapidly along the outside of the cabin, leaving the couple in a total state of alert. Marie looks through the slit of the door and warns with much joy that the elite hunters finally returned in safety from the forest. Satisfied to see the group back, Elric praises everyone's fast work and thanks for the immense effort they made to protect his wife. But in the middle of his words of thanks, the young master's countenance suddenly turns serious and suspicious upon looking at the men. He looks around in an attentive way and asks where Luton is, causing the hunters to lower their heads with a quite hesitant expression. One of the hunters confesses that the knight ordered them to retreat and stayed behind to face the entire pack of wolves alone, giving a direct order of flight that they couldn't disobey. Hearing that, Elric grinds his teeth from pure frustration and grumbles, irritated with the stubbornness and idiotus of his great childhood friend. Without losing time, he orders the hunters to escort Tyria and Marie in safety back down and warns he will return to the forest to save Luton. But right in the time he turns to leave the cabin, a small and delicate hand holds his sleeve with much strength to stop him. Elric looks sideways back and sees his wife, who confesses with a trembling voice the terrifying fear she feels of seeing him hurt again. With tears streaming down her beautiful green eyes, she implores for him to promise that he will return to her arms in total safety. Tyria's firm grip on his sleeve leaves clear all the anguish and worry she carries in her chest with that dangerous situation. She repeats her desperate appeal, incapable of enduring the idea of losing the man she so loves to the claws of those forest monsters. Elric holds her hand with extreme delicacy, sincerely thanks her for the affection, and asks with a very comforting look for her to trust his words. With a very tender smile, the young master promises he will bring his friend back and will return safe and sound home. Convinced by her husband's firm words, she slowly releases her grip on his outfit, allowing him to depart for the snowy forest. However, she warns in a quite serious and moved tone that, case he breaks that promise, she really will never forgive him again. Elric cracks one last tender smile from the corner of his mouth, agrees with his head in a firm way, and says he will guard very well that promise before departing for his friend's rescue. Meanwhile, in the middle of the frozen forest, the heavy paws of a blade wolf run fiercely through the cold snow. Luton, quite hurt and very tired, readies himself with his sword to receive the impact of the attack of a beast that leaps in his direction. With much combat skill, the knight manages to deliver certain strikes to defend himself and bring down the monsters trying to encircle him. Completely panting and with his face covered in blood, he tries in all ways to regain his breath while holding firm his weapon. However, upon looking forward, he notices with anguish that an entire pack of magical beasts keeps advancing relentlessly against him. Before that totally desperate situation, he lets out an ironic laugh, admitting he didn't expect to meet so many monsters gathered at one single time. His eyes begin to weigh on account of exhaustion, and his consciousness threatens to fail at any moment in the middle of the battlefield. He realizes he lost far too much blood and that his vision is darkening rapidly before the relentless horde of wolves that approaches. Accepting his tragic fate, Luton shouts with all his strength that at least he will have the grand honor of dying protecting his beloved native land. Already on his knees, and without strength even to raise his own sword from the ground, he asks himself, confused why the beasts stopped the attack all of a sudden. One of the blade wolves backs away a bit and growls in a hesitant way, sensing an extremely intimidating and powerful presence approach the location. But suddenly, one of the beasts ignores the warning and leaps furious to deliver the final blow against the knight who is defenseless. Without being able to do anything to defend himself, Luton merely closes his eyes and readies himself to receive the impact of the creature's sharp teeth. But a certain and thunderous shot cuts the air right in time, traversing the head of the monster who falls completely lifeless on the ground covered in snow. Luton opens his eyes startled and asks himself very confused if the elite hunters would have returned to help him in the battle. But to his total surprise, who appears holding the grand firearm is Elric, who jokes saying he is with a terrible appearance for a royal knight. Elric tosses the shotgun aside, commenting that he doesn't much like that style of weapon, while Luton asks desperate for Tyria and hears relieved that she is already totally safe with the monsters still around them. Elric warns in a very calm way that he will need to ask a great favor of his companion. The young lord points directly to the brilliant royal knight sword that is in the hands of his injured friend. He asks in a mild way if the companion would mind lending him his weapon for a few instants to resolve that situation. Luton answers immediately that he would give even his own life if his friend asked, handing over the hilt of the sword to him without thinking twice. However, he warns, quite worried that royal weapon is extremely heavy and doesn't look like anything compared to the wooden swords they used in the times of childhood. But without demonstrating the least effort, Elric carries out rapid and perfect movements with the blade, slicing through the cold wind and leaving Luton completely jaw-dropped. Looking sideways, Elric comments in a serene way that Luton always had a lot of curiosity to know what he went around doing during the 10 years he was far from Wibben. He advances with firmness in the direction of the pack of wolves and says with a calm voice that it is time to show his true combat power to his childhood friend. The monstrous beasts growl loud and ready themselves to advance with all fury against the new opponent who dares to face them. The young master envelops the borrowed sword with a blue and brilliant magical energy, commenting that they say blade wolves are extremely sensitive to mana. The beasts roar furious upon feeling that massive magical pressure coming from the young man, readying themselves with savagery for the clash. Holding the sword infused with the brilliant energy, Elric advances alone with impressive speed against the entire horde of monsters before him. A rapid and relentless cut slices the air with precision, raising a great cloud of white snow around his body. The young man delivers a devastating attack, slicing one of the beasts in half in a fraction of a second with his immense physical strength. Another wolf trying to attack him by surprise from the back is hit in a certain way and falls eliminated right away over the frozen soil. Luton watches that scene of pure destruction completely shocked, admitting mentally that he doesn't have the least idea of what happened during his friend's long absence. He concludes with absolute certainty that man before his eyes definitely is no longer the small Franzino boy with whom he used to play in childhood. The young master continues his relentless combat, moving with extreme ease and precision in the middle of the pack of hungry monsters. His red eyes shine in a very focused way while he executes one more rapid and fatal attack with Luton's brilliant blade. In a few instants, all the remaining blade wolves are completely defeated and fall lifeless over the frozen soil of the forest. With the battlefield finally silent, Elric looks sideways back to his injured companion on the ground. He raises the brilliant sword high, feeling that his rescue mission there was fulfilled with total success. A strong wave of magical energy dissipates through the freezing air of the forest of Wibben, marking the definitive end of that intense combat. The young master lowers the weapon calmly, returning to his peaceful and serene posture from before Luton continues fallen on the ground with an expression of total incredulity and shock. Before the overwhelming strength he just witnessed, Elric breaks the silence in a friendly way and asks his companion what he thought of that rapid combat demonstration. With a light and very welcoming smile, he asks if that finally served to cure all the curiosity his friend had about his past. Luton collapses for good, seated over the snow, letting out a deep sigh and grumbling that all that he just saw is simply unbelievable. He confesses with sincerity that now he is even more confused and surprised with his friend's skills than he was before the battle. Back in the cozy interior of the wooden cabin, Tyria sincerely thanks the knight for all the effort he made to help them. With his body all bandaged on account of the fight injuries, Luton admits in a humble way that the one who resolved everything for real was his captain. Elric tosses aside the compliments, saying he wouldn't have managed to resolve everything alone, and asks if his friend could do him one more knight favor. Luton smiles back and answers with total loyalty that his friend saved his life 2 times, so he doesn't need to ask anything. Being enough just to give his order, Elric suggests to his friend that he assume all the credit for having defeated the beasts, explaining that he prefers not to draw attention to himself, which leaves Luton extremely shocked. Elric claims he has his own personal reasons and asks that special favor, while the knight hesitates a bit, finding the situation unfair to the true hero. Luton ponders in silence for a few instants, catching all the seriousness and the importance of that request to his captain. A short time later, a great crowd gathers in the district of Wibben to celebrate and acclaim the knight Luton as the great savior of the region. The leader of the local elders praises warmly the young warrior. Impressed by him having faced so many dangerous beasts completely alone, Luton scratches his head quite awkward before everyone and tries to explain in a modest way that in reality he did almost nothing special. But in the middle of the crowd, Elric appears disguised as a guard and subtly places his finger on his lips, signaling for his friend to maintain the secret. Upon seeing his companion's silent signal, Luton interrupts his speech immediately. Aware that he needs to fulfill his word, he then brushes it off, saying he only raised his sword for the peace of Wibben, receiving a shower of compliments for honoring the kingdom with his bravery. The elder turns to the public and asks for a grand and warm applause for the knight, crowning him officially as the savior of that province. All the local people begin shouting and applauding with much enthusiasm, celebrating the grand victory against the terrifying threat that plagued the forest. Satisfied to see that everything went right, Elric cracks a beautiful smile from the corner of his mouth and decides that it is already time to return to his house. A short time later, the snowy courtyard of the Portman mansion is prepared to receive the return of the young family leader. The family's luxurious carriage approaches the main entrance of the residence beneath the gray winter sky. The vehicle's wheels finally stop spinning over the frozen soil, indicating the definitive end of that trip. Elric steps down from the vehicle and is received with much affection by Tyria, who awaited him anxious at the main entrance of the mansion. With a beautiful smile and her cheeks very red, she gives the welcomes to her husband and confesses she was already starting to worry about his delay. The youth apologizes in a very affectionate way, explaining that he was delayed a bit only because he wanted to thank and bid farewell properly to Luton. Tyria asks worriedly about the state of his leg and if he still needs support, and Elric explains that the doctor only advised him to avoid unnecessary efforts for a time. He takes a few firm steps on the ground and shows with a joyful smile that, as she herself can see, he is already feeling perfectly well. But next, Elric's countenance acquires a much more serious and composed tone upon addressing his wife again. He stares at her with much affection in his eyes and begs earnestly for her to promise never more to place herself in a situation of so great danger. Touched with all his worry, Tyria smiles in a mild way and guarantees she will guard that advice with much affection in her chest. Elric suggests they don't stay out there exposed to the rigorous cold of the snow and head straight inside, receiving the immediate agreement of his beloved. He holds the latch of polished metal and opens the grand door of the residence with total ease so she can pass. With much politeness and a joyful smile on his face, the young lord gives passage for his wife to enter. First, observing the romantic scene from afar, the maids whisper amused and joke that the climate between the couple is so warm it looks like summer. Tyria approaches her husband and whispers a very affectionate thanks for all he did to help her in the forest. But in the middle of her words, the young lady suddenly loses her strength and collapses out of reaction forward, leaving Elric extremely startled. He catches her with haste in his arms and shouts Tyria's name in pure desperation, imploring in panic for his beloved wife to wake up immediately. The carriage runs in a rush, while young Tyria, totally pale and unconscious, is supported with much care by her maid. The doctor examines the young lady and explains to Elric that her state of health is much more serious than he imagined. With a quite worried look, he reveals that unfortunately, the girl might be reaching a critical and quite dangerous point. The doctor laments the situation and comments that the late Lord Hovan had exactly this same expression on his face when he fell sick in the past. Desperate with the possibility of losing his wife, Elric grabs the doctor's shoulder with much strength. The young lord implores from the bottom of his heart for the doctor to do absolutely everything that is in his reach, because Tyria is the most precious person of his life. Before so much suffering, the doctor lowers his head in a respectful way and promises he will do his best to save her. With that, the carriage departs in a rush down the road, covered in snow beneath the gray sky. On the outside of the mansion, Elric tries to regain his breath in the middle of the freezing cold when he hears someone calling for him without strength to endure such sighs anguish. The young man collapses on his knees on the snowy ground, while the maids run desperate to help him. Marie and Rhonda try to support their master, begging earnestly for him to take a deep breath and try to maintain his calm in that so difficult moment. Some time later, a melancholic calm takes over the immense mansion, while Elric sits completely alone at the dinner table. He stares at the plate full of food in a pensive way, without having the least heart to take a single forkful. At that moment, he remembers when Tyria used to sit by his side and ask with affection if the meal wasn't to his liking. The image of his wife smiling sweetly at him continues very alive in his mind, bringing a massive squeeze in his chest. Elric recalls when he commented with her that the two hadn't been talking much in recent times. On that occasion, he actually asked in a timid way for them to talk for a little more time. Back in reality, the untouched food remains over the table beneath the worried look of the house staff. Rhonda sighs downcast and comments in a low voice that the master didn't even touch the breakfast they prepared with so much care. Without knowing what to do to help, the head maid decides to withdraw from the room while Marie observes the situation with deep sadness. One of the maids gathers the tray with the untouched plates, lamenting that the master didn't eat anything. Marie stands shocked with the situation, remembering that normally the young man devoured everything they placed in front of him. In a few minutes, Rhonda approaches him and calls his attention in a gentle way for the lack of nourishment, but Elric merely begs apologies and explains he is totally without appetite. Worried for the young man's health, the head maid suggests he take a walk through the garden his wife so loved to frequent. Upon arriving there, Elric runs face to face with a massive amount of gorgeous blue roses that cover the entire lawn. The young man asks, surprised, if that was really Tyria's garden, and Rhonda confirms, saying the young lady took care of each detail there with much affection even before he came back home. She explains that those incredible flowers managed to bloom even in the rigorous winter thanks to a perfect combination of dedication, magical energy, and engineering. The head maid still comments she remembers how Elric himself adored plants when he was just a child, but he answers that those are only distant memories. While watching the blue petals fall to the wind, Elric thinks to himself that the scent of the flowers is not the only thing that inhabits his mind lately. In reality, what truly torments him are the dark memories of the battlefields packed with stretched bodies and fire. Rhonda sits close to the flowers and reveals that Tyria had a great dream in her youth of becoming a combat doctor on the battlefields. The revelation leaves Elric extremely shocked, because he never imagined a young noble lady could desire something so dangerous. This conversation causes an old recollection to come to his mind, showing the hands of a little girl delivering a mysterious small sack in the past. Upon noticing her master seems distant, Rhonda asks if he is feeling well, and the young man answers that he only just remembered something important he had forgotten. Seeing the weather cool even more, the head maid suggests they return to the mansion's warmth, and Elric agrees immediately. The reddish sunset begins covering the sky above the Portman family's imposing residence. Already in the interior of the grand house, the loyal butler Aldio is startled upon seeing the master enter suddenly in his path. Elric gets confused upon running into him and questions the reason the old man is working precisely in Tyria's study. The butler points to the table full of papers and explains he needs to review all that paperwork, revealing he learned to do that during half of his life serving the old lord. Upon hearing this, Elric gets quite irritated and complains that the butler should have helped his wife before, since that absurd load of work was the reason she fainted. With much calm and elegance, Aldio answers that he did all that only because he was following the direct and strict orders of Tyria herself. The young man comprehends the situation and, a bit calmer, asks if there exists anything he can do to help, but the old man politely refuses the support to maintain focus on his tasks. Respecting the servant's decision, Elric warns he will ask for Rhonda to prepare a hot tea and bids him farewell in a polite way. Sometime later, young Marie walks hurried down the hallway shoving an elegant tea cart. She knocks in a light way on the wooden door and warns she brought the drink, receiving immediate permission from the young man to enter the room. Upon opening the door, the maid runs face to face with her master seated on the sofa with a deeply downcast and pensive look. Marie feels the tense mood in the air and holds the tray with quite a bit of care, visibly worried for the young man's emotional state. With calm movements, she serves the steaming drink into a decorated porcelain cup, trying to bring a bit of comfort. The young maid cracks a beautiful smile and explains she brought the rose tea that her mistress so loved to drink. Elric stares at the golden liquid in the cup in a nostalgic manner and merely murmurs he comprehends, feeling his wife's absence. Upon noticing the master's sadness, Marie tries to console him and asks for him not to lose hope, because she has certainty that Tyria will recover soon. Moved with the maid's worry, Elric cracks a forced smile and begs apologies for making her worry without necessity. Marie bows rapidly and explains in a quite hurried way that it was no bother at all, but that she turned really anxious upon seeing him so disheartened. Quite nervous with the situation, the young maid bids farewell in a rush and runs out of the room, closing the door with force right after again, alone in the silence of the room. Elric lets out a long sigh and murmurs his beloved's name with his heart squeezed. He looks in the direction of the window, and beneath the full moon's light that shines between the dark clouds of the night, hopes from the bottom of his soul that she improves soon. Meanwhile, the cold night advances in a silent way over the village, covering in snow the roof of the medical clinic where the young lady is under care. Inside the resting room, Tyria breathes with much difficulty due to the strong fever she feels, while the nurse notes the information with a quite worried countenance. Even being extremely weak and with her mind confused by the illness, the young lady tries to fight against the sickness and thinks she can't continue lying down in that way. A solitary tear streams down Tyria's feverish face upon thinking that her husband will end up falling sick from so much worry if she doesn't get up soon. Upon noticing a slight movement in the bed, the nurse approaches surprised and asks with quite a bit of caution. If the mistress is finally waking up, Tyria opens her eyes in a very slow way in the middle of extreme fatigue, causing the assistant to begin calling her in a loud voice to try and keep her conscious.